In the heart of Manhattan's most exclusive lounge, a single whispered command from a billion-dollar CEO would change everything. Take me home or you're fired. But Daniel Reed, a widowed father who'd learned to read desperation in his daughter's nightmares, saw past the power play immediately. The trembling fingers, the terror barely masked as dominance. The dangerous man watching from across the room with a predator's patience. This wasn't a proposition. This was a woman drowning in public, using the only weapon she had left, her authority, to beg for help. What Daniel didn't know yet was that saving Miranda Wolfe would cost him everything he'd built to protect his daughter, and give him back something he thought he'd buried with his wife. If you want to see how a single father's quiet courage transforms a CEO's carefully constructed world, stay until the end of this story. And please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story reaches across the globe. The fluorescent lights of Morrison & Lynch's accounting department had long since shut off for the weekend, leaving only the blue glow of Daniel Reed's monitor to illuminate the scattered evidence of his double life. Coffee cups formed a timeline across his desk, mornings careful pour, afternoons desperate refill, evenings cold necessity. His daughter Emma's crayon drawing hung crooked on his cubicle wall. 3 stick figures holding hands, one smaller than the others, one labeled Mommy, with a halo sketched above her head in purple. Daniel checked his watch, 8:47 p.m. The after-hours daycare closed at 9, and Mrs. Chen had already texted twice. He could see the message preview without unlocking his phone. Emma asking for you. 3 words that carried the weight of every promise he'd made at Rachel's funeral 18 months ago, when a drunk driver had turned his world into a before and after that his 5-year-old daughter still couldn't fully comprehend. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, finishing the quarterly reconciliation that his supervisor had urgently needed by Monday morning. Never mind that Daniel had spent his lunch hour on a conference call about Emma's adjustment issues at kindergarten, or that he'd arrived at 6 a.m. to make up the time. In the corporate mathematics of Morrison & Lynch, dedication was measured in billable hours and face time, not in the quiet sacrifices of a single parent holding together what remained of his family. Still here, Reed? The voice sliced through his concentration. Marcus Webb, senior analyst and unofficial enforcer of the unwritten rules about ambition and availability. His suit probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent in Queens. Just finishing the Techron portfolio, Daniel replied without looking up, saving his work with the muscle memory of someone who'd learned that computers crashed at the worst possible moments. Client dinner ran long? Marcus's tone carried the particular smugness of someone whose Friday nights involved expense accounts and cocktails, not daycare pickups and bedtime stories. Something like that. Daniel shut down his computer and grabbed his jacket, the same one he'd worn to Rachel's funeral, now with a small stain on the sleeve where Emma had wiped her hands after eating strawberries in the car. He could feel Marcus watching him, cataloging this moment for future reference. In the 18 months since Rachel's death, Daniel had learned to navigate the invisible currents of corporate judgment. The sympathetic looks had lasted perhaps 6 weeks. Then came the subtle shift. The missed happy hours became evidence of insufficient commitment. The early departures to handle Emma's doctor appointments transformed into whispered concerns about dedication. But Daniel had stopped caring about whispered concerns around the same time he'd learned to braid his daughter's hair from YouTube tutorials at 2 a.m, her tiny body shaking from nightmares about car crashes and disappearing mothers. The elevator descended through Morrison & Lynch's 37 floors in silence. Daniel watched the numbers fall, each one marking another level of the corporate hierarchy he'd once been certain he'd climb. Regional analyst, senior analyst, director, vice president. The carefully plotted trajectory of a man who'd believed that hard work and talent were sufficient. That was before he'd learned the true cost of ambition. The night shifts Rachel had worked to support his MBA, the family dinners missed, the tiny erosions of time that could never be recovered. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, all marble and chrome and the particular hush of expensive real estate. Daniel had exactly 11 minutes to catch the subway, retrieve Emma, and avoid Mrs. Chen's increasingly pointed observations about work-life balance. Then he saw Miranda Wolfe. She stood near the building's entrance, surrounded by a small constellation of executives in evening wear, her presence commanding attention in that effortless way of people accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. CEO of Morrison & Lynch, architect of the firm's transformation from respected regional player to global powerhouse, and, according to Forbes, the youngest woman to ever helm a major financial services company. Daniel had seen her perhaps 3 times in the 2 years he'd worked here, always at a distance that maintained the proper separation between corporate royalty and the common workforce. Tonight, she wore a black dress that probably cost more than his car, her dark hair swept back to reveal features that belonged on magazine covers, which they frequently graced. But something was off. Daniel had spent 18 months reading his daughter's fears in the space between words, translating Emma's careful silences into the language of grief and adjustment. He'd developed an almost preternatural ability to sense distress beneath polished surfaces. Miranda Woolf was terrified. It showed in the too bright smile, the slight rigidity of her shoulders, the way her left hand gripped her clutch with white-knuckled intensity. The executives around her seemed oblivious, caught up in their Friday night momentum, already half drunk on proximity to power and whatever they'd consumed at dinner. But Daniel saw it clearly, a woman performing composure while something fundamental crumbled beneath. Then he saw what she was looking at. A man stood near the bar in Morrison & Lynch's street-level lounge, the semi-public space where deals were celebrated and clients were impressed. Tall, tailored, radiating the particular confidence of inherited wealth and unchallenged privilege. He wasn't looking directly at Miranda, but his attention was focused on her with the intensity of a predator who'd already selected his prey. Daniel recognized the type from his childhood in working-class Baltimore. Men who'd never heard the word no delivered in a way that made them believe it. The man raised his glass in Miranda's direction, a gesture that could have been mistaken for friendly acknowledgement by anyone who wasn't watching Miranda's reaction. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a crack in the armor that none of her companions seemed to notice. Daniel should have kept walking, should have pushed through the revolving doors and headed for the subway. Emma, the carefully constructed routine that kept his fractured world functioning. He had 8 minutes now, and Mrs. Chen's patience had limits. Instead, he found himself moving toward the lounge. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he was doing. Rachel used to tease him about this, his inability to ignore someone struggling, even when helping meant complicating his own life. "Your hero complex is going to get you in trouble one day," she'd said, laughing, not knowing that the one time she'd need saving, he'd been 300 miles away at a conference, too late to do anything but identify her body and explain to their daughter why mommy wasn't coming home. Daniel reached the edge of Miranda's group just as she turned toward him, her eyes meeting his with startling directness. Up close, he could see the calculation in her gaze, the rapid assessment of threat, utility, escape routes. Whatever she saw in his face made something shift in her expression. Daniel? His name from her lips stunned him. He'd assumed she wouldn't know it, that he existed far below the altitude where CEO awareness operated. "I was hoping you were still here." The executives around her fell silent, their attention swiveling to Daniel with various degrees of curiosity and confusion. Marcus Webb, who'd somehow materialized in the lounge, looked like he'd swallowed something sharp. "Ms. Woolf," Daniel managed, aware that he was still holding his worn jacket, that his tie was loosened, that he looked exactly like what he was. A tired single father, racing against daycare closing time. "Walk me out?" It was phrased as a question, but her eyes told a different story. She closed the distance between them in 3 steps, her hand settling on his arm with enough pressure to communicate urgency. "I've been monopolizing these gentlemen all evening. I'm sure they'd like to enjoy their Friday night." The dismissal was smooth, practiced, delivered with the kind of authority that made disagreement feel like insubordination. The executives murmured polite goodbyes, already fragmenting back toward the bar, toward weekend freedom. But the man who'd been watching, still watching, pushed off from his position with the languid movement of someone who had no intention of being dismissed. "Miranda." His voice carried across the lobby, smooth and cultured and edged with something Daniel's instincts immediately flagged as dangerous. "You're not leaving already? The night's just getting started." Miranda's fingers tightened on Daniel's arm. "Julian, I didn't realize you were here." The lie was transparent, confirmed by the way Julian Cross, Daniel recognized him now from the society pages, old money real estate, the kind of wealth that made billion-dollar CEOs seem almost ordinary, smiled with cold amusement. Didn't you? Julian moved closer, his attention shifting to Daniel with the kind of assessment a man gives to an unexpected obstacle. I don't believe we've met. Julian Cross. He extended his hand and Daniel had no choice but to take it. The handshake was exactly what he'd expected. Calculated pressure, designed to establish dominance, the grip held just a fraction too long. Daniel Reed. And how do you know our Miranda? Julian's use of possessive was deliberate, a verbal marking of territory. Before Daniel could formulate a response that wouldn't immediately complicate his employment status, Miranda spoke. Daniel and I have been seeing each other. The words dropped into the lobby like a grenade with the pin pulled. Daniel felt his entire future pivot on this moment. The careful stability he'd built for Emma, the job that paid for their apartment and her school, and the therapy sessions that helped her process her mother's death. Every rational impulse screamed at him to step back, to correct this obvious fiction, to preserve the professional distance that kept single fathers employed. But he'd seen the terror in Miranda's eyes, the trembling she couldn't quite control. He knew what it looked like when someone was drowning. That's right, Daniel heard himself say, the commitment made before he'd fully processed its implications. Julian's expression shifted through several calculations before settling on something between disbelief and anger. Seeing each other. How unexpected. He turned to Miranda, and Daniel saw something ugly flash across his features before the cultured mask reasserted itself. You've certainly moved on quickly. Julian, Miranda's voice held a warning note. No, it's wonderful, really. Julian's smile could have cut glass. Though I'm surprised you didn't mention it at the Greenhouse Initiative dinner last week, or the Phillips Collection Gala, or any of the dozen other events where you've been, what's the phrase, focusing on your career? Daniel felt Miranda's hand trembling against his arm and made a decision. He'd spent 18 months learning to project calm in the face of his daughter's storms, to be the unshakable presence that made Emma feel safe enough to grieve. That skill translated. We've been keeping it private, Daniel said, his voice steady, given the professional complications. Professional complications. Julian repeated the phrase like he was tasting something bitter. You work for Morrison and Lynch? I'm an analyst here, yes. An analyst. The way Julian said it made the word sound like something scraped off a shoe. How egalitarian of you, Miranda, dating down the corporate ladder. Very progressive. The insult was expertly delivered, designed to cut at both of them while maintaining plausible deniability. Daniel had grown up with men like this. They'd been his classmates at Hopkins on scholarship, the legacy admissions who'd made sport of reminding him exactly where he ranked in the social hierarchy. Miranda's composure cracked just slightly. Julian, I don't think... Take me home. Miranda turned to Daniel, her voice dropping to something just above a whisper, but her eyes were desperate. Please, take me home, or... She stopped, seemed to catch herself, but the unspoken ending hung between them. Or you're fired. Daniel heard it clearly in the space between her words, saw it in the way her gaze held his. But he also saw what Julian couldn't, what the lingering executives at the bar wouldn't understand. This wasn't the ultimatum it sounded like. This was a woman using the only weapon she had, her authority, to beg for help. Of course, Daniel said quietly. Julian's mask slipped completely for just an instant, revealing something dark and possessive. Miranda, we need to talk about... There's nothing to talk about. Miranda's CEO voice returned, cold and final. Good night, Julian. She guided Daniel toward the exit with the kind of determined momentum that made pursuit awkward in a semi-public space. Julian watched them go, and Daniel could feel the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, full of threat and calculation and promises of future consequences. They made it through the revolving door and onto Fifth Avenue before Miranda's composure finally shattered. Her hand released his arm and went to her throat, and for a moment Daniel thought she might actually be sick on the pristine sidewalk. I'm sorry, she managed, her voice rough. I'm so sorry. I had no right to... Are you safe? Daniel asked, because that was the only question that mattered. Right now, are you safe? Miranda looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her face broke in a way that made her seem suddenly, startlingly human. I don't know. Daniel checked his watch. 9:02 p.m. He'd missed the daycare pickup. Mrs. Chen would be furious, and Emma would be the last child there, experiencing yet another small abandonment in a year defined by a massive one. The responsible choice, the father choice, was to call a car for Miranda and deal with his own crisis. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed Mrs. Chen's number. She answered on the first ring, her disapproval already evident in her tone. Mr. Reed, we close at 9. I know, Mrs. Chen, and I'm so sorry. There's an emergency at work. I can be there in 40 minutes. I'll pay the late fee, double, if necessary. A pause during which he could hear Emma's voice in the background asking if Daddy was coming. The sound nearly broke him. 1 hour, Mrs. Chen said finally. And Mr. Reed, this cannot keep happening. I know, thank you. He hung up and turned to Miranda, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I have an hour to get you somewhere safe and get back to Queens to pick up my daughter. Where do you live? You have a daughter? It wasn't a question, but her tone carried surprise. I do, Emma. She's 5. And she's waiting for me because I just used my one favor with the daycare director to make sure you're okay. So I need you to tell me, where can you go that Julian Cross won't find you tonight? Miranda stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel watched her cycle through options, rejecting each one. The corporate apartment would have a doorman who could be charmed or bribed. Hotels would require credit cards that left trails. Friends would ask questions she clearly wasn't ready to answer. I don't know, she admitted finally, and the vulnerability in those 3 words was more shocking than anything that had happened in the lobby. Daniel thought of Emma, waiting, thought of the careful boundaries he'd maintained since Rachel's death, the deliberate simplicity of his life, thought of how completely this moment violated every reasonable principle of self-preservation. My apartment, he heard himself say. It's small, and there are toys everywhere, but it's in Queens, and nobody would think to look for you there. I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. I'm offering. 1 night until you figure out a real plan, and then I need to get my daughter and pretend like the CEO of my company isn't hiding out in my living room. A sound escaped Miranda that might have been a laugh, or might have been something closer to a sob. This is insane. Completely, Daniel agreed. But I don't think you have a lot of better options in the next 57 minutes. Miranda looked back at the building, where Julian Cross was probably still in the lounge, calculating his next move. Then she looked at Daniel, really looked at him, taking in the worn jacket, the tired eyes, the complete ordinariness of a man who had no business getting involved in whatever dangerous game she was playing. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, let's go. They caught a taxi because the subway would take too long and Daniel's car was parked at a garage near his apartment. Miranda gave the driver the address in Astoria, and they settled into the back seat with the careful distance of 2 people who just crossed a line neither of them fully understood. For the first 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. Daniel watched the city slide past the windows, Manhattan giving way to the bridge giving way to Queens, wealth and power diluting into the ordinary landscape of his actual life. He thought about what he'd just done, the spectacular stupidity of involving himself in whatever mess Miranda Wolfe had stumbled into. He thought about Emma and Mrs. Chen's warning, and the very real possibility that he'd just destroyed his career and stability to help a woman he didn't actually know. Why did you help me? Miranda's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. Daniel considered several diplomatic answers before settling on the truth. You look terrified, and I know what it's like to need help and not be able to ask for it properly. The way I asked wasn't proper at all. It was manipulative and unfair. It was desperate, Daniel corrected. There's a difference. Miranda was quiet for a moment. Julian is my ex-fiancé. We ended things 6 months ago, and he's been persistent about wanting me back. Persistent. Daniel kept his voice neutral, but he'd already cataloged the implications of that particular euphemism. He shows up at events, finds ways to manufacture conversations, makes it clear that he's watching, that he knows my schedule, where I'll be. Miranda's hands twisted in her lap. Tonight, he cornered me at dinner, insisted we needed to talk privately. I managed to avoid being alone with him, but then he followed us back to the building. Have you reported him? To who? The bitterness in her voice was sharp. Julian Cross's family owns half of Manhattan's historic properties. His mother sits on 3 boards with Morrison and Lynch's largest clients. A restraining order would become headline news, and the narrative would be that I'm the unstable woman who can't handle a breakup. It would undermine everything I've built. Daniel understood immediately. He'd seen it play out at smaller scales, the careful calculations women made about when to report harassment, how much professional capital they could afford to spend on being believed. For someone at Miranda's level, the stakes would be exponentially higher. So you've been handling it alone. I've been trying to make myself unavailable, accepting fewer public appearances, keeping my schedule unpredictable. But he always finds a way to be there. She looked at Daniel and he saw the exhaustion beneath her polished exterior. Tonight when I saw him at the bar, I needed him to see that I'd moved on, that whatever he thinks we had is over. And you picked me because I was convenient. I picked you because you were looking at me like you actually saw me, Miranda said quietly. Everyone else was too drunk or too intimidated to notice I was barely holding it together, but you saw it immediately. The taxi pulled up to Daniel's building, a modest 5-story walk-up that had probably been elegant in the 1950s and was now just affordable enough for a single father with careful budgeting. Miranda looked at it with something that might have been trepidation. Last chance to reconsider, Daniel said, paying the driver. I can have him take you somewhere else. Miranda looked at her phone, where several texts were presumably waiting. Julian's continued contact, the digital stalking that left no physical evidence but kept her constantly on edge. No, this is good. Thank you. They climbed to the 3rd floor, Daniel's legs moving on autopilot up the familiar stairs. At his door, he paused with his key in hand. Fair warning, it's not what you're used to. He pushed open the door to reveal his life in all its ordinary chaos. Emma's backpack by the entrance, tiny shoes scattered in the hallway. The living room that doubled as a play space, filled with the careful disorder of a childhood being lived, blocks and dolls and picture books forming small archaeological layers of his daughter's development. The couch was second-hand, the television modest. Photos covered one wall. Emma as a newborn. Emma's first birthday. Emma and Rachel at the beach 3 months before the accident. Miranda stepped inside and Daniel saw his home through her eyes. The careful poverty of it, the way he'd tried to make it warm and safe on a budget that wouldn't cover her dry cleaning bill. But when she turned to look at him, there was no judgment in her expression. It's lovely, she said, and sounded like she meant it. Daniel checked his watch. 23 minutes to get back to Queens, retrieve Emma, and somehow pretend that his world hadn't just tilted sideways. Make yourself comfortable. There's food in the fridge if you're hungry. I'll be back in an hour with Emma. He paused at the door, suddenly aware of how surreal this situation was. Try not to touch anything expensive, because there isn't anything expensive to touch. That pulled a genuine smile from Miranda, the first he'd seen all night. I'll do my best. Daniel made it back to the daycare with 3 minutes to spare. Mrs. Chen handed Emma over with a look that promised a serious conversation in the near future about reliability and responsibility. Emma's face lit up when she saw him, and the guilt that had been gnawing at Daniel's chest since he'd made his choice in the lobby intensified. Daddy! She launched herself at him, and he caught her, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the indefinable smell of childhood that was already slipping away too fast. Hey, baby, I'm sorry I'm late. Mrs. Chen said you had emergency at work. Emma pulled back to look at him seriously. Did someone get hurt? No, sweetheart, just some complicated grown-up stuff. He set her down and took her hand, the small fingers gripping his with automatic trust that made his heart ache. Come on, let's go home. On the subway, Emma chattered about her day. A complicated story about playground politics involving a disputed swing and someone named Marcus who was mean but not all the time. Daniel listened with half his attention, the other half trying to figure out how to explain Miranda's presence to his 5-year-old daughter. There was no good explanation. No way to frame this that made sense without exposing Emma to complexities she was too young to understand. He'd always tried to be honest with her, especially after Rachel died. The therapist had been clear about not hiding grief, about letting Emma see that sadness was natural and healing was possible. But how did he explain that he'd brought home his CEO to protect her from a dangerous ex-fiancé without opening a conversation about adult relationships and threats that Emma didn't need in her world? They reached the apartment to find Miranda sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by Emma's picture books. She'd removed her heels and let down her hair, and the transformation was startling. She looked younger, less armored, almost approachable. Emma stopped in the doorway, her hand tightening on Daniel's. "Daddy? Who's that?" Miranda looked up, and Daniel watched her cycle through several possible responses before settling on simple honesty. "Hi, I'm Miranda. I work with your dad, and I needed a safe place to stay tonight. Is it okay if I'm here?" The question was asked to Emma directly, treating her like a person whose opinion mattered. Daniel saw his daughter process this, her natural wariness of strangers competing with the flattery of being consulted. "Did someone hurt you?" Emma asked, with the directness of children who'd learned that bad things happen to good people. "Someone scared me," Miranda said carefully, "and your dad helped me. He's very brave." Emma considered this, then walked over to Miranda and patted her hand with the automatic comfort of a child who understood fear. "It's okay. Daddy makes the bad dreams go away. He can help you too." The simple confidence in her voice, the absolute faith that her father could fix anything, made Daniel's throat tight. He caught Miranda's expression, saw something crumble behind her eyes. "Thank you," Miranda managed. "That's very kind." Daniel made dinner, mac and cheese from a box because it was Emma's favorite, and because his culinary skills peaked somewhere around functional. Miranda offered to help, and he set her to work cutting vegetables while Emma provided a running commentary on everything from her favorite color, purple, but sometimes green, to the complex social dynamics of kindergarten. They ate at the small table that barely fit 3 people, and Daniel watched Miranda navigate the surreal normalcy of it. The plastic plates with cartoon characters, Emma's elaborate story about a caterpillar who wanted to be a butterfly but was scared of heights, the ordinary magic of a Friday night dinner in Queens. After dinner, Emma retreated to her room to play while Daniel cleaned up. Miranda helped, and they worked in comfortable silence until she finally spoke. "This is what you rushed home to," she said quietly, the emergency that made Mrs. Chen so angry. "Every night," Daniel confirmed. "Emma's had a hard year. She needs routine, stability. She needs to know I'll always be there when I say I will." "Her mother?" "Car accident, 18 months ago." The words still hurt to say, the summary that reduced Rachel's death to a tragic statistic. Drunk driver ran a red light. She died instantly. "I'm so sorry." Daniel rinsed a plate and set it in the drying rack. "Everyone's sorry. It doesn't change anything." Miranda was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "What you did tonight, helping me, risking Mrs. Chen's anger, bringing me here, why would you do that when you have Emma to think about?" It was a fair question. Daniel had been asking himself the same thing since the taxi ride to Queens. He could say it was instinct, or habit, or the remnants of the man he'd been before grief had stripped him down to the essential task of keeping his daughter safe. But those were all partial truths. "When Rachel died, I was 300 miles away at a conference," Daniel said, the confession emerging in the quiet space between dinner and bedtime. "I got the call at 2 in the morning. By the time I made it back, she was already gone. I never got to help her, never got to be there when she needed me." He set down the dish he'd been washing and turned to face Miranda. "I can't save everyone, can't fix everything that's broken. But when I saw you tonight, looking terrified and trying to hide it, and when no one else seemed to notice or care, I couldn't walk away. Not again." Miranda's expression shifted through several emotions Daniel couldn't quite name. "I'm not your second chance for redemption. I know, but maybe just for tonight we both needed help. You needed somewhere safe to go. I needed to know I could still recognize when someone was drowning and actually do something about it." Before Miranda could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, pink with cartoon clouds, slightly too small because she was growing so fast and children's clothes were expensive. Daddy, story time! Daniel glanced at the clock. 8:30, right on schedule. He looked at Miranda, suddenly uncertain. I need to... Go, Miranda said immediately. I'll finish here. Emma tugged at his hand but paused to look at Miranda. Do you like stories? I do, Miranda said. You can listen if you want. Daddy does the voices really good. It was an invitation delivered with the casual generosity of childhood, before the world taught you to guard your space and calculate the cost of kindness. Miranda looked at Daniel, a question in her eyes. He shrugged. Fair warning, the voices are not that good. They ended up in Emma's room, a small space that Daniel had tried to make as warm and safe as possible. The walls were painted soft lavender at Emma's insistence, decorated with her artwork and photographs of Rachel. Her bookshelf overflowed with picture books, many of them about grief and loss and finding hope after terrible things happened. Emma climbed into bed and patted the space next to her. Daddy sits here. Miranda can have the chair. Daniel settled onto the narrow bed while Miranda took the small chair by the window, the one he sometimes sat in on bad nights when Emma's nightmares woke them both. Emma produced her current favorite book, a story about a bear who learned to be brave after his mother went away to the stars. Daniel had read it perhaps 50 times, knew every word by heart. But tonight, with Miranda watching, he was hyper-aware of how the story paralleled their life, the loss, the fear, the slow building of courage. He did the voices like always, making Emma giggle at his attempt at bear sounds, and watched his daughter's eyes grow heavy with sleep. By the time he finished, Emma was fighting to stay awake, her small body relaxing into the familiar ritual. Love you, Daddy, she mumbled, already halfway to dreams. Love you too, baby. Daniel kissed her forehead, tucking the blanket around her with practiced care. Sweet dreams. He stood, motioning for Miranda to follow him out. They left the door cracked open. Emma still needed the hallway light to chase away the dark, and made their way back to the living room. Miranda sank onto the couch, and Daniel watched something in her posture shift, the corporate armor that had briefly returned during dinner finally cracking completely. She's remarkable, Miranda said quietly. So brave for someone who's been through so much. She's 5, she shouldn't have to be brave. Daniel sat in the chair across from her, maintaining the careful distance of professional courtesy that felt increasingly absurd. But we don't always get choices about the things that break us. No, Miranda agreed, we don't. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way that surprised Daniel. This woman, this powerful CEO who occupied a completely different world from his own, sat in his living room looking somehow both out of place and exactly where she needed to be. Thank you, Miranda said finally, for tonight, for all of it. I know I put you in an impossible position, and I know tomorrow is going to be complicated, but thank you. Daniel thought about the complications waiting for them, the corporate gossip, the potential fallout, Julian Cross's inevitable retaliation. He thought about Emma and Mrs. Chen's warning, and the careful stability he'd built that was now tilting precariously. You're welcome, son, he said, because what else was there to say? Miranda's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and Daniel saw her expression harden. Julian, 12 texts, 4 calls. She silenced the phone without reading the messages. He's not going to stop. What would make him stop? I don't know. Proof that I've actually moved on. Public acknowledgement that we're done. Something that makes it real enough that he can't pretend it's just a temporary disagreement. Daniel heard the exhaustion in her voice. The weight of months or maybe years of managing Julian's obsession while maintaining her professional image. An idea formed, terrible and reckless and completely insane. The charity gala next month, Daniel said slowly. Morrison and Lynch's annual fundraiser. You always attend, right? It's expected. Why? Julian will be there. Society event, all the major donors. If you showed up with someone, with a partner, and made it clear you'd moved on. Miranda's eyes widened as she understood where he was going. That's crazy. Completely. It would mean maintaining this fiction for weeks, public appearances, more lies. Yes. Your job could be at risk if anyone thought you were leveraging a relationship with me for professional gain. Emma's stability could be affected. All true. Miranda stared at him. So why would you even suggest it? Daniel thought about his daughter's simple faith that he could make bad dreams go away. Thought about Rachel and the help he'd never been able to give her. Thought about the woman sitting in his living room, powerful and accomplished and quietly terrified. Because you're drowning, he said simply. And maybe for a little while, I can be the life raft. We maintain the fiction, we show Julian you've moved on, and then we quietly end it. No drama, no complications, just long enough to make him believe it's real. That's an enormous risk for you. I'm aware. I can't ask you to eat. You're not asking, I'm offering. Miranda looked at him for a long moment, and Daniel saw her calculating, weighing options, trying to find the trap, or the angle, or the ulterior motive. He understood. In her world, nothing came without strings, without cost, without someone looking for leverage. Why? She asked finally. Really? Why would you do this? Daniel thought about all the complicated truths, his guilt over Rachel, his instinct to help, the way Miranda's terror had triggered something in him that he'd thought grief had burned away. But the simplest answer was also the most honest. Because you asked me to take you home, he said, and because in that moment I saw someone who needed help and couldn't safely ask for it. Everything else is just details. Tears gathered in Miranda's eyes, and she blinked them away with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned not to show weakness. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. No. But maybe that's exactly why this could work. No history, no expectations, just two people helping each other survive something difficult. Miranda was quiet, considering. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but soft. If we do this, there have to be rules, boundaries. I won't risk your job or Emma's stability. The moment this becomes too complicated or starts affecting your daughter, we stop. Agreed. And we're honest with each other. No games, no manipulation. This is a mutual arrangement with a clear end date. Makes sense. And afterward, when it's done, we go back to being CEO and analyst. Professional distance, no lingering complications. Daniel nodded, even as something in him wondered if that kind of clean ending was actually possible. When do we start? There's a client dinner Tuesday night. Morrison & Lynch is hosting, and Julian's company is one of the invited firms. If you came as my guest, it would send the message. I'd need a better suit. That pulled a surprised laugh from Miranda, the sound startling in its genuine warmth. I'll have my assistant arrange it. Taylor, everything you need. Consider it part of the arrangement. They talked through logistics for another hour, cover stories, public appearances, how to handle questions from colleagues and clients. It felt surreal, planning out a fake relationship with the clinical precision of a business deal. But beneath the practicalities, Daniel sensed something else. Two people creating a temporary alliance against the chaos of their respective lives. By the time they finished, it was past 11. Daniel set Miranda up in his room, the only space with a door that closed and a bed that wasn't child-sized. He'd take the couch, which wouldn't be the first time. Emma had nightmares often enough that he'd gotten used to sleeping in whatever location her 2 a.m. fears required. As he gathered blankets and tried to make the couch comfortable, Miranda stood in the doorway to his room, looking oddly vulnerable in her designer dress in his modest apartment. Daniel? He looked up. Yeah? I know I keep saying thank you, but I mean it. What you're doing, it's more than I had any right to ask. You didn't ask, Daniel reminded her gently. I offered. Miranda smiled, but her eyes were serious. I'm going to make sure this doesn't cost you anything. Your job, your stability, Emma's security, I'll protect all of it. That's my promise. Okay. She disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly. Daniel settled onto the couch, his mind spinning with the magnitude of what he'd just agreed to. In the space of 3 hours, he'd gone from a single father grinding through a Friday night deadline to a man preparing to fake a relationship with his CEO to protect her from a dangerous ex-fiancé. Rachel would have called him crazy, would have pointed out all the ways this could explode, all the risks he was taking, but she'd also have understood. She'd loved his hero complex even when it frustrated her, had seen it as part of who he was at his core. Daniel closed his eyes, listening to the familiar sounds of his apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, Emma's soft breathing from her room. Tomorrow he'd figure out how to explain Miranda's presence if Emma woke up early. Tomorrow he'd start navigating the impossible complexity of maintaining a fiction that needed to look real enough to convince Julian Cross while protecting the actual life he'd built for his daughter. But tonight, in the quiet hours between crisis and consequence, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could help both Miranda and himself find a way through their respective darkness. Even if the path was crooked and uncertain, even if the cost was yet to be calculated, even if the ending was already written to be temporary and clean. In his bedroom, Miranda Woolf lay in a stranger's bed in a borrowed space in Queens, and for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been safe. The man sleeping on the couch to protect her hadn't asked for anything, hadn't tried to leverage her vulnerability, hadn't looked at her like she was a problem to solve or a prize to win. He'd simply seen someone drowning and extended a hand. She thought about Tuesday's dinner, about facing Julian with Daniel beside her, thought about the risk this ordinary man was taking to help someone he barely knew, thought about his daughter's simple faith that her father could chase away bad dreams. And Miranda Woolf, CEO of Morrison & Lynch, woman who'd built an empire on calculated decisions and careful control, allowed herself to hope that maybe this impossible arrangement might actually work. That maybe, for just a little while, she could stop running and start standing still. That maybe the quiet courage of a single father was exactly the kind of strength she needed to finally break free. Outside, the city hummed with its endless energy, millions of lives intersecting and diverging in the complicated mathematics of human connection. And in a modest apartment in Queens, two people who should never have crossed paths began building something fragile and necessary from the raw materials of fear and trust, and the desperate hope that kindness could still matter in a world that often forgot its value. The night settled around them, uncertain and promising, full of risks they'd chosen and consequences they'd yet to discover. Saturday morning arrived with Emma's voice cutting through Daniel's uneasy sleep on the couch. "Daddy, why is the pretty lady sleeping in your bed?" Daniel's eyes snapped open to find his daughter standing inches from his face, her expression caught between curiosity and concern. Through the fog of too little sleep, he registered that Miranda's bedroom door stood open, and his daughter had apparently done some independent investigation. "Emma, we talked about knocking," Daniel said, sitting up and trying to organize his thoughts into something a 5-year-old could understand without launching into complicated adult territory. "I did knock," she said. "Come in." Emma climbed onto the couch beside him, her small body radiating the boundless energy of childhood mornings. "She's really pretty, Daddy, like a princess." Daniel heard movement from the bedroom and turned to see Miranda emerge, wearing one of his old Hopkins t-shirts that fell to mid-thigh, her hair loose around her shoulders. Without makeup and corporate armor, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and Daniel felt the sudden awkwardness of their situation settle over him like a weight. "Good morning," Miranda said, her voice still rough with sleep. "I hope I didn't overstep." Emma was very polite with her knocking. "It's fine." Daniel stood, aware that he was wearing the same clothes from last night, that he probably looked as rumpled as he felt. "Emma, why don't you go pick out your clothes for today? Remember, we're going to the park." Emma's face lit up, but she didn't immediately move. "Can Miranda come to the park?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating in its innocence. Daniel opened his mouth to deflect, to explain that Miranda probably had important things to do, but Miranda spoke first. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "If it's okay with your dad." Emma looked at Daniel with such hope that he felt his carefully maintained boundaries crumbling. This was already too complicated, too real. They were supposed to be maintaining a fiction for public consumption, not weaving Miranda into the actual fabric of his life with Emma. But he couldn't explain that to his daughter without opening conversations about lies and arrangements and adult complications that had no place in her world. "Sure," he heard himself say. "Go get dressed, baby. Something warm. It's cold out." Emma scampered off, leaving Daniel and Miranda alone in the living room's morning light. The intimacy of the moment struck him. This woman in his apartment, wearing his clothes, about to spend the day with his daughter. Every rational alarm in his head was screaming about boundaries and professional distance and the careful separation he'd maintained between his work life and Emma's world. "I'm sorry," Miranda said immediately. I should have said no. This is already too much, too fast. It's okay. She would have asked questions if you'd suddenly disappeared. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the disorientation of how quickly his life had shifted. But Miranda, we need to be careful. Emma's been through enough. She doesn't need to get attached to someone who's only temporarily in our lives. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw Miranda flinch slightly, but she nodded, her expression understanding. You're right. I'll keep it friendly but distant, just for today, and then I'll figure out my own living situation. They made breakfast together in the kind of awkward synchronization of people learning to navigate shared space. Miranda proved surprisingly capable with scrambled eggs, and Daniel handled toast and orange juice, while Emma provided a running commentary on her stuffed animal's complex social hierarchy. The domesticity of it felt surreal. His CEO standing at his stove, his daughter chattering about playground politics, Saturday morning stretching out with possibility instead of the usual structured routine. After breakfast, while Emma brushed her teeth, Miranda borrowed Daniel's phone to check her messages. Her expression darkened as she scrolled, and Daniel saw her jaw tighten with suppressed anger. Julian? He asked quietly. 17 more texts, 3 voicemails. He's escalating. Miranda handed back the phone, her hands trembling slightly. He knows where I live, where I work, where I'll be for every public appearance. The only place he doesn't know about is here. The implications settled over Daniel like a shadow. His apartment, his sanctuary with Emma, had become Miranda's only truly safe space. The temporary nature of this arrangement was already becoming more complicated than either of them had anticipated. We stick to the plan, Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. The client dinner Tuesday. Public appearances that establish we're together. Make it real enough that he has to believe it. And in the meantime, you stay safe. Even if that means staying here another night or two until you can arrange something more permanent. Miranda looked at him, and Daniel saw the calculation in her eyes. The CEO brain trying to find the angle, the cost, the inevitable complication. I can get a hotel, use cash, register under a friend's name. I shouldn't be here, in Emma's space, disrupting your life. Emma's already seen you, already invited you to the park. Suddenly disappearing would raise more questions than staying. Daniel heard the rationalization in his own words, the way he was talking himself into extending this impossible situation. One more day. We go to the park, act normal, and tonight we figure out a real plan. The park in Astoria was one of Emma's favorite places. A small patch of green with playground equipment that had seen better years, and a collection of regular families who'd formed their own weekend community. Daniel had been coming here since Emma was a toddler, finding comfort in the routine, and the other parents who understood the particular challenges of single parenthood. Today, walking through the entrance with Miranda beside him and Emma skipping ahead, Daniel felt the weight of curious stares. Miranda had borrowed a pair of his old jeans that she'd rolled at the ankles and a sweater that hung loose on her smaller frame. But even dressed down, she carried herself with a presence that drew attention. Or maybe it was just that Daniel Reed, the quiet widower who always came alone with his daughter, had suddenly appeared with a striking woman who didn't quite fit the neighborhood aesthetic. Daddy, push me! Emma was already at the swings, her favorite spot, waiting with the impatience of childhood for her routine. Daniel moved to the swings while Miranda hung back, uncertain. But Emma, with the inclusive instinct that grief hadn't yet stolen, called out, Miranda can push too! We can go really high! So they pushed Emma together, finding a rhythm that made her shriek with delight. And Daniel watched Miranda's careful facade crack further as his daughter's joy became infectious, pulling laughter from the CEO that sounded genuine and unguarded. Higher, Daddy! Miranda, push harder! I don't think we should go much higher, sweetheart, Daniel said, but he was smiling despite himself, caught up in Emma's enthusiasm. Your dad's right, Miranda added, timing her pushes with Daniel's. We don't want you flying off to the moon. But I want to see the stars. That's where Mommy is. The word stopped Daniel mid-push, his hands freezing on the swing's chain. Emma had been talking about Rachel more lately. Her therapist said it was healthy, a sign of processing grief. But hearing it now, with Miranda present, made the loss feel suddenly raw again. Miranda's hands stilled too, and Daniel saw understanding flash across her face. She stepped back, giving them space, and Daniel caught the swing gently, bringing Emma to a slower pace. Mommy's watching from the stars, Daniel said quietly, the words familiar from countless similar conversations. But you don't need to fly to see her. She's always with you. I know. Emma twisted in the swing to look at him, her small face serious. But sometimes I forget what she looks like, even with the pictures. The confession hit Daniel in the chest. Emma had been 3.5 when Rachel died. Her memories already starting to fade into the abstract concept of mommy who went away. The photos helped, the stories helped, but he couldn't give her back what the drunk driver had stolen. That's okay, Daniel managed. That's what the pictures are for. And I'll always tell you stories about her so you'll know who she was. Emma seemed satisfied with this, her attention already shifting back to the playground. Can I go on the slide? Sure, baby. I'll be right here watching. Emma ran off, her grief compartmentalized with the resilience of children who'd learned that sadness came in waves but didn't have to drown you. Daniel watched her go, feeling the familiar ache of single parenthood, the knowledge that he was both mother and father now, responsible for keeping Rachel's memory alive while helping Emma build new happiness. I'm sorry, Miranda said softly, standing beside him. I didn't mean to intrude on that moment. You didn't. It's part of our life. Emma processes her grief out loud whenever it hits her. Daniel kept his eyes on his daughter, now climbing the slide with determined focus. The therapist says it's healthy, that she needs to talk about Rachel to keep her real. It must be hard doing this alone. Daniel glanced at Miranda, saw genuine empathy in her expression. It's what she needs. What we both need. And we're not really alone. We have Mrs. Chen at daycare, Emma's therapist, the other parents here. It's not the family we planned, but it works. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Emma play. Around them, the park filled with weekend life. Other families, other children, the ordinary magic of a Saturday morning in Queens. Daniel saw Jennifer Martinez, another single parent whose husband had left when their son was 2, wave from across the playground. He waved back, aware that she was studying Miranda with unconcealed curiosity. You're going to get questions, Miranda observed, following his gaze. Probably. This neighborhood is small. People notice things. What will you tell them? Daniel considered this. The truth was impossible, that he was fake dating his CEO to protect her from a stalker ex-fiancé. But lying felt wrong, especially to people who'd supported him through Rachel's death and Emma's difficult adjustment. He settled on a middle ground. That I'm seeing someone new, that it's early, so we're taking it slow. That keeps it simple without too many details. Miranda nodded, but something flickered across her face that Daniel couldn't quite read. Right, simple. Emma returned, breathless and flushed from running. Daddy, I'm hungry. Already? We just had breakfast. That was forever ago. Emma grabbed his hand, then reached for Miranda's, linking the three of them together with the unconscious ease of a child who didn't yet understand the complexity of adult relationships. Can we get ice cream? It's not even noon yet, Daniel protested, but he was already weakening. Emma's joy was hard to deny, especially when it came in moments like this, uncomplicated and bright. Please? Miranda wants ice cream too, I can tell. Miranda looked at Daniel, a question in her eyes. He saw her struggling with the same tension he felt, the awareness that every shared moment was weaving them deeper into a fiction that would eventually have to end. But Emma was watching them both with such hope, her small hand warm in Miranda's, and sometimes the right choice was just the kind one. 1 scoop, Daniel conceded. And lunch after. Real food. They walked to the small ice cream shop 3 blocks from the park, Emma between them, chattering about her favorite flavors and whether chocolate or strawberry was objectively superior. Daniel let her voice wash over him, trying to memorize this moment. His daughter happy, the autumn sun warm on his shoulders, the unexpected comfort of not being alone in the small rituals of parenting. At the shop, Emma ordered strawberry with rainbow sprinkles, her standing choice. Daniel got vanilla because that's what he always got, and Miranda surprised them both by ordering mint chocolate chip. Interesting choice, Daniel observed, paying before Miranda could object. My mother hated mint ice cream, Miranda said, then looked surprised at her own admission. Said it tasted like toothpaste, so naturally, I loved it. Emma giggled at this, delighted by the small rebellion. My mommy liked coffee ice cream. Daddy says it's gross. It is gross, Daniel confirmed. Coffee should be drunk, not frozen. They ate their ice cream at a small table outside, and Daniel watched Miranda engage with Emma's rambling stories about kindergarten with genuine attention. She asked questions, laughed at the right moments, treated his daughter like a person whose thoughts mattered. It was such a simple thing, but Daniel had learned that not everyone knew how to talk to children without condescension or forced enthusiasm. Marcus pushed Emma T. off the swings, Emma was saying, her face serious as she recounted this grave injustice. The teacher said that wasn't nice, but Marcus said Emma T. was hogging. That's a tough situation, Miranda said thoughtfully. What do you think the fair thing would have been? Emma considered this, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. Maybe Marcus should have asked first, and maybe Emma T. should have shared, but pushing is always wrong. That's very wise, Miranda agreed. Sometimes there's not one right answer, just trying to be kind while also being fair. Daniel watched this exchange with something twisting in his chest. This was dangerous territory, this easy comfort between Miranda and Emma. His daughter was already attaching, already including Miranda in her world. When this arrangement ended, and it would end, they'd both been clear about that, Emma would experience another loss, another person who'd been present and then disappeared. He was about to suggest they head home when his phone buzzed. Marcus Webb's name appeared on the screen, and Daniel's stomach tightened. His colleague never called on weekends unless something was wrong. I need to take this, Daniel said, stepping away from the table. Marcus? What's up? Reed. Marcus's voice carried barely suppressed excitement. Interesting news from last night. Apparently you and Miranda Wolf are dating? Daniel's blood went cold. They'd only decided on this arrangement 12 hours ago, had made one public appearance leaving the office together. How had the gossip spread so fast? I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel said carefully. Come on, Reed. Julian Cross was at Meridian last night, telling anyone who'd listened that our CEO has moved on with some analyst from her own company. He seemed pretty upset about it. Marcus paused, and Daniel could hear the calculation in the silence. So is it true? Are you actually seeing Miranda Wolf? Daniel's mind raced through options. Denying it would contradict the fiction they needed to maintain for Julian. Confirming it would open him up to corporate scrutiny, potential ethics investigations, the exact complications they'd hoped to avoid. But Marcus was already spreading this conversation, and silence would only fuel more speculation. It's personal, Marcus, and it's new, so I'd appreciate some discretion. Discretion. Marcus laughed, sharp and cold. You're dating the CEO, and you want discretion? Reed, do you have any idea how many policies this probably violates? How it's going to look when you get promoted over people who've been here longer, worked harder, didn't sleep their way up? It's not like that, Daniel said, his voice hardening. Isn't it? Come on, Reed. We all know you've been struggling since your wife died. Single dad, bills to pay, career going nowhere. And suddenly the CEO takes an interest? It's pretty convenient. The anger that flooded through Daniel was cold and focused. My personal life is none of your business. And if you're implying something inappropriate, maybe you should consider whether spreading unfounded rumors about the CEO is a smart career move. He hung up before Marcus could respond, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. When he turned back to the table, Miranda was watching him with concern, Emma still chattering about playground politics, blissfully unaware. Problem? Miranda asked quietly. We need to talk, Daniel said. Not here. Let's get Emma home. The walk back to the apartment was tense, Emma's bright mood a contrast to the careful silence between the adults. Once home, Daniel set Emma up with her coloring books and pulled Miranda into the kitchen, keeping his voice low. Julian talked last night. Told people at some bar that you'd moved on with an analyst from Morrison and Lynch. It's already spreading. Marcus just called to congratulate me on dating the CEO and insinuate that I'm sleeping my way to a promotion. Miranda's face went pale. I'm so sorry. I should have anticipated Julian would do this. He wants to damage me, and now he's found a way to damage you too. It's not your fault. We knew there'd be complications. Daniel leaned against the counter, trying to think through the implications. But we need to get ahead of this. If it's already gossip, we need to control the narrative before HR starts asking questions. I'll talk to HR on Monday, Miranda said immediately. Full disclosure, preempt any ethics concerns. We'll present it as a new relationship, started recently, with proper boundaries and no professional favoritism. That puts a target on my back. Everyone will be watching, waiting for any sign of preferential treatment. My work will be scrutinized, my promotions questioned, my credibility shot. Then we end it now, Miranda said, her voice tight. I'll release a statement saying Julian was mistaken, that we're colleagues and nothing more. You go back to your life, I figure out another way to handle him. Daniel thought about Julian Cross, about the way he'd looked at Miranda with possessive rage, thought about her trembling hands and the fear she'd been managing alone for months, thought about the texts and calls, the stalking disguised as persistence. No, he said finally, we're already in this. Backing out now just makes us both look dishonest. We stick to the plan, but we do it right. Professional boundaries at work, public relationship outside of it. And we document everything so there's no question of impropriety. Daniel, this could ruin your career. You have Emma to think about, stability to maintain. I can't ask you to risk that. You're not asking, I'm choosing. He met her eyes, saw the guilt and fear there. But Miranda, we have to be smart about this. No special treatment at work, no perception of favoritism. I stay in my current role, take on the same projects I would have anyway. The relationship stays completely separate from professional advancement. Miranda nodded slowly. Okay, and I'll make sure there's a paper trail for everything. HR briefings, board notifications if necessary, complete transparency about the relationship and our commitment to maintaining professional boundaries. From the living room, Emma called out, Daddy, I need the purple crayon. The normalcy of his daughter's request was jarring against the conversation they were having. Daniel looked at Miranda, this woman who'd stumbled into his life 24 hours ago and was now reshaping everything he'd carefully constructed. This is going to get messy, he said quietly. I know. And if it's too much, if at any point this starts affecting Emma or your stability, you tell me. We end it immediately, no questions asked. Deal. They spent the rest of Saturday in careful normalcy. Emma played, watched cartoons, helped Daniel make dinner. Miranda stayed but tried to maintain distance, aware of the attachment concerns he'd raised. But Emma, with the persistent affection of children who decided they liked someone, kept pulling Miranda back into her orbit. By bedtime, when Emma asked if Miranda would stay for the story again, Daniel didn't have the heart to refuse. This time Miranda sat closer, and Emma leaned against her during the reading with comfortable trust. Daniel watched them, his daughter and this woman who was supposed to be temporary, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with their arrangement. After Emma fell asleep, Daniel and Miranda returned to the living room. The television played quietly, some forgettable movie neither of them was watching. The couch felt smaller with both of them on it, maintaining careful space while the day's intimacy lingered between them. She's getting attached, Daniel said quietly. To you. I know, I'm trying to be careful, but she's very persuasive. She is, Daniel smiled despite the concern gnawing at him. Rachel used to say Emma could talk her way out of anything with those big eyes and that serious voice. Tell me about Rachel, Miranda said, and the request surprised him. If you want to. I keep feeling like I'm intruding on her memory, being here in your home, with Emma. But I don't actually know anything about her. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, organizing thoughts he usually kept carefully contained. She was a labor and delivery nurse. That's how we met. I was visiting a friend who'd just had a baby, and Rachel was the one who brought her in, talking about skin-to-skin contact and the importance of those first hours. She was passionate about her work, about helping new mothers feel confident and supported. The memories came easier than he'd expected, maybe because it had been so long since anyone had asked. She wanted to be a midwife, was taking classes for it, but then Emma came along earlier than we'd planned, and we decided she'd wait until our daughter was older. There'd be time, we thought, except there wasn't. I'm sorry, Miranda said softly. Everyone says that, and I know they mean it, but sorry doesn't change the fact that she's gone, that Emma's growing up without her mother, that I'm fumbling through parenthood alone trying to be enough for a daughter who deserves both parents. You're doing an incredible job. Emma is happy, well-adjusted, loved. That's not fumbling. Daniel looked at Miranda, saw the sincerity in her expression. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding it together. The daycare pickups I miss, the bedtime routines I mess up, the questions about her mom that I can't answer properly because I wasn't there. I'm just trying not to break anything else. You're enough, Miranda said, and the certainty in her voice surprised him. Emma knows she's loved. That's the foundation everything else builds on. They sat in the comfortable silence of people learning to be honest with each other. The movie ended, another started, and neither of them moved to change the channel. What about you? Daniel asked eventually. What's your story with Julian? Miranda's expression shuddered slightly, old defenses rising, but then she seemed to make a decision, letting the walls drop. We met at a charity function 3 years ago. He was charming, cultured, from the kind of family that opens doors in business and society. Dating him made sense. We moved in the same circles, understood the demands of high-profile careers, complemented each other professionally. But I didn't love him. I appreciated him, enjoyed his company, thought that was enough for a partnership. He proposed at another charity gala, very public, very orchestrated. I said yes because it seemed like the logical next step. And because saying no in front of 500 people felt impossible. Daniel heard the regret in her voice. What changed? I did. Or maybe I finally admitted what I'd always known, that I was building a life based on what looked right instead of what felt right. I broke it off 6 months ago, tried to do it privately and respectfully. But Julian doesn't handle rejection well. He's used to getting what he wants, and apparently what he wants is me, whether I agree or not. So he's been stalking you. Showing up at events, texting, calling, making sure I know he's watching, never crossing the line into something I could report without looking unstable or vindictive. Just persistent enough to make me feel hunted. The frustration in her voice was palpable. Daniel understood the trap. The way people like Julian operated in the spaces between legal consequences, using social pressure and reputation management as weapons. And last night, seeing you with me probably made it worse, Daniel said. Probably. Julian doesn't like being shown up, especially publicly. But maybe that's what it takes to make him finally accept it's over. Miranda looked at Daniel, vulnerability clear in her expression. I'm sorry you got pulled into this. Into my mess. I pulled myself in, Daniel corrected. And maybe we both needed this. You needed safety. I needed... He trailed off, not sure how to articulate what he'd needed. I needed to know I could still help someone, that I wasn't so lost in survival mode that I'd stopped seeing when people were drowning. You're a good man, Daniel Reed. The words settled between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was ready to fully examine. Daniel felt the space on the couch between them like a physical thing, awareness shifting into something more complicated than their carefully outlined arrangement. I should let you sleep, Miranda said, standing. You've got Emma duty tomorrow, and I've already disrupted enough of your weekend. It's okay. She likes you. She likes everyone. She's 5 and hasn't learned to guard her heart yet. The observation stung because it was true. Emma gave her affection freely, trusted easily, believed that people who came into her life would stay. The divorce rate among Daniel's fellow parents at the park was high enough that he'd seen the damage when children learned that love could be temporary. Just be careful with her, Daniel said quietly. When this ends, I'll explain it to her somehow. But she's already lost so much. I can't let her lose anyone else she started to care about. Miranda's expression softened with understanding. I'll be careful. I promise. She disappeared into the bedroom, and Daniel settled onto the couch, with his blanket and the weight of choices made and complications yet to unfold. Through the thin walls, he could hear Emma's soft breathing, the familiar soundtrack of his daughter sleeping safely. Everything he did, every risk he took, had to be measured against that sound. The proof that she was okay, that he hadn't broken the one thing he'd promised Rachel he'd protect. But as he drifted towards sleep, Daniel couldn't shake the image of Miranda reading to Emma, the way his daughter had leaned against her with such trust. Couldn't stop thinking about the conversation in the kitchen, the vulnerability behind Miranda's polished exterior. Couldn't ignore the fact that this arrangement, this temporary fiction, was starting to feel dangerously real. Sunday morning brought complications before breakfast. Daniel woke to find Emma already up, sitting at the kitchen table with Miranda, both of them coloring in Emma's Disney princess book. The scene was domestic and perfect and completely unsustainable. "Morning, Daddy." Emma looked up, her face bright with uncomplicated joy. "Miranda makes really good pancakes. She put chocolate chips in them." Daniel looked at the stack of pancakes on the counter, perfectly golden, and felt the careful boundaries he'd tried to maintain crumbling further. "I thought we were having cereal today." "Miranda said pancakes are better for Sundays," Emma reported, returning to her coloring with renewed focus. Daniel met Miranda's eyes across the kitchen, saw apology and something else, a hesitant hope that maybe she was doing something right. And despite every rational reason to maintain distance, Daniel found himself smiling. "Pancakes it is," he said, pouring coffee and trying not to think about how easily this could become habit, how dangerous it was to let Emma see this as normal, how much harder it would be to explain when Miranda inevitably had to leave their lives. But for now, on a Sunday morning in Queens with chocolate chip pancakes and his daughter's laughter filling the apartment, Daniel let himself pretend that maybe, just maybe, this complicated fiction could hold together long enough to protect everyone involved. He just hoped the cost wouldn't be more than any of them could afford to pay. The chocolate chip pancakes turned out to be just the beginning of Sunday's complications. By noon, Miranda had helped Emma build an elaborate blanket fort in the living room, complete with fairy lights that Daniel didn't even know he owned, and by 2 o'clock, his daughter was calling her Rhonda, with the kind of casual affection that made Daniel's chest tight with worry. He was folding laundry in the bedroom when Miranda found him, her expression troubled. "We need to talk about Tuesday." Tuesday. The client dinner. Their first public appearance as a couple in front of Morrison and Lynch's executives and Julian Cross. Daniel set down the small pink shirt he'd been folding, one of Emma's favorites, with a unicorn on the front, and gave Miranda his full attention. "What about it?" "I got an email from Julian this morning. He's bringing a date." Miranda's voice was carefully controlled, but Daniel heard the tension underneath. "Some socialite he's been photographed with before. He's making a statement. That we're both moving on. That he's unbothered. That my relationship with you is insignificant enough that he can parade around with someone else and prove he never really cared." Miranda sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders tight. "It's a power play. He wants to make me look pathetic for using you as a shield when he's already replaced me." Daniel understood the strategy immediately. Julian was trying to flip the narrative to make Miranda appear desperate while he seemed desirable and unaffected. The kind of social manipulation that people like Julian Cross excelled at, using reputation and perception as weapons. "So we call his bluff," Daniel said simply. "We show up together, we're confident and comfortable, and we make it clear that whatever he's doing doesn't matter to us." "Daniel, you don't understand the world you're stepping into. These people are sharks. They'll be analyzing every interaction, looking for cracks, spreading gossip that could destroy both our careers. And you'll be walking in as the analyst who's dating his CEO, which already makes you a target." "I know." Daniel folded another of Emma's shirts, the domestic task grounding him against the anxiety trying to creep in. "But backing out now just confirms Julian's narrative. We're already committed. All we can do is be convincing enough that people believe it." Miranda was quiet for a moment, watching him fold laundry with the mechanical precision of single parenthood. "You're calmer about this than I expected." "I'm terrified," Daniel admitted. "But I learned something when Rachel died. You can't control what other people think or say or believe. You can only control how you show up. So Tuesday night, I'll show up as your partner. Everything else is just noise." From the living room, Emma's voice called out, "Randa, the fort is falling. We need emergency repairs." Miranda smiled despite the tension in her shoulders. "I should go. Fort maintenance is apparently critical." She left, and Daniel heard Emma's delighted laughter as Miranda presumably fixed whatever architectural crisis had developed. He finished folding the laundry, trying not to think about how seamlessly Miranda had integrated into their weekend routine. How Emma had stopped asking when Miranda was leaving and started assuming she'd be there for meals and playtime and bedtime stories. This was exactly what he'd worried about. Emma was attaching, building expectations and assumptions that would shatter when this arrangement inevitably ended. And yet Daniel couldn't bring himself to pull back, to create the distance that would protect his daughter's heart. Because Emma was happy in a way she hadn't been since Rachel died. And happiness was so precious that Daniel found himself willing to risk the eventual pain. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Martinez, the single mom from the park. "Saw you with someone yesterday. She seems nice. Coffee sometime to dish?" Daniel stared at the message, aware that his carefully private life was becoming increasingly public. Jennifer meant well, but coffee would lead to questions he couldn't fully answer, observations that might reveal the cracks in his and Miranda's fiction. He typed back a non-committal response about being busy with work, adding it to the growing list of social complications this arrangement was creating. Sunday evening arrived too quickly, bringing with it the reality that Miranda needed to leave. She'd stayed 2 nights, and while Daniel's couch was serviceable for emergency situations, it wasn't a long-term solution. More importantly, Emma needed to understand that Miranda had her own life, her own home, her own space separate from theirs. "I should get back to my apartment," Miranda said after dinner, her voice gentle but firm. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Emma's face fell immediately. "But you just got here!" "I've been here since Friday night, sweetheart," Miranda corrected, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "And your dad has been very kind to let me stay. But I have my own home, and I need to go back to it." "When will you come back?" Emma's voice carried the particular anxiety of a child who'd learned that people who left sometimes never returned. Daniel saw Miranda hesitate, saw her calculating the right response that wouldn't make promises she couldn't keep while also not devastating his daughter. He stepped in before the silence could stretch too long. "Miranda and I are going to dinner Tuesday night," Daniel said, crouching beside them, "for my work. So we'll see each other then. Can I come?" Emma's hope was painful to witness. "No, baby, it's a grown-up dinner. But you'll stay with Mrs. Chen, and I'll be home right after to tell you about it." Emma processed this with the serious consideration she gave to all matters of separation and return. "Promise?" "Promise." Miranda called a car service, and they waited together in the apartment's small lobby for it to arrive. Emma insisted on coming down to say goodbye properly, her small hand clutching Daniel's while they stood in the fluorescent lighting that made everything look tired and worn. When the car pulled up, Miranda hugged Emma with unexpected warmth. "Thank you for sharing your dad with me this weekend, and for teaching me about fort construction. I clearly have a lot to learn." Emma giggled, but her arms tightened around Miranda's neck. "You're a good learner. Next time you can be chief engineer." "It's a deal." Miranda straightened and turned to Daniel, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the weight of the weekend settling between them. She'd seen his life in all its ordinary chaos, the laundry and the bedtime routines, the park visits and the chocolate chip pancakes, the profound intimacy of single parenthood laid bare. And he'd seen past her CEO armor to the frightened woman beneath, the vulnerability she couldn't show anywhere else. "Thank you," Miranda said quietly, "for everything." "See you Tuesday," Daniel replied, keeping it simple because Emma was watching with the acute attention of children who picked up on adult undercurrents. Miranda left, and Daniel and Emma climbed back up to their apartment. His daughter was quiet on the stairs, processing something in the careful way she'd developed since Rachel's death. "Daddy?" Emma said as they reached their door. "Is Randa going to be my new mommy?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on managing the professional complications and protecting Emma from attachment that he hadn't considered she might be building a completely different narrative in her 5-year-old mind. He led Emma to the couch and pulled her into his lap, choosing his words with the care of someone navigating a minefield. "No, sweetheart. Miranda is someone Daddy is spending time with, but she's not going to be your mommy. You only get one mommy, and that's the mommy who's watching from the stars." "But you like Randa, I can tell." Daniel's throat tightened. "I do like her. She's very nice. But liking someone and them becoming your parent are different things. And even if someday, a long time from now, Daddy met someone special, they wouldn't replace your mommy. Nobody could ever do that." Emma was quiet, her small body warm against his chest. "Marcus's mom has a new boyfriend. Marcus says he's mean and makes his mom sad." Daniel made a mental note to check in with Jennifer about Marcus's home situation, but kept his focus on Emma. "I'm sorry Marcus is going through that, but that's not what's happening here. Miranda is someone Daddy is getting to know, and she really likes you, but nothing is changing with our family. It's still you and me, just like always. Promise?" "Promise, baby." Emma seemed satisfied with this, her resilience showing in how quickly she shifted topics to something about her stuffed animal's complex social dynamics. But Daniel sat holding her long after she'd moved on, wondering how many more promises he could make before one of them broke something beyond repair. Monday morning brought Daniel back to Morrison and Lynch with the acute awareness that everything had changed. He walked through the lobby where he'd first seen Miranda's fear, rode the elevator to the 37th floor where his cubicle waited, and felt the weight of curious stares following him through the office. The gossip had spread over the weekend, growing with each retelling. Daniel Reed, quiet widower and devoted single father, was dating CEO Miranda Wolfe. The whispers followed him to his desk, the sidelong glances tracking his movements. By the time he'd logged into his computer, Marcus Webb was already leaning against his cubicle wall with an expression of calculated interest. "Reed, productive weekend." "Fine, thanks." Daniel kept his tone neutral, refusing to engage with whatever game Marcus was playing. "I'm surprised you're here. Figured you'd be working from the executive floor now, given your new connections." "I work where I've always worked, Marcus. Nothing's changed." "Everything's changed." Marcus's smile was sharp. "You're sleeping with the CEO. That changes everything about your position here, whether you want to admit it or not." Daniel looked up from his computer, meeting Marcus's gaze directly. "My personal life is separate from my professional responsibilities. If you have concerns about favoritism or ethics violations, I suggest you take them to HR. Otherwise, I have work to do." The dismissal was clear, and Marcus's expression hardened. But before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Webb, don't you have the Techron analysis due this afternoon?" They both turned to find Sarah Chen, Miranda's executive assistant, standing at the cubicle entrance with the kind of polite steel that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Marcus straightened, his swagger faltering slightly. "Just having a friendly conversation," Marcus said. "I'm sure. But Miss Wolfe asked me to remind the senior analyst that the deadline is firm." Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. "She's very particular about punctuality." Marcus left with a final glare at Daniel, and Sarah turned her attention to the man who'd apparently become her boss's boyfriend over a single weekend. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Daniel saw the assessment in her eyes. "Ms. Wolfe would like to see you in her office at 10, Sarah said. "She has some matters to discuss regarding Tuesday's client dinner." "Of course." "Thank you, Sarah." Sarah nodded and left, but not before Daniel caught the slight softening in her expression. Whatever Miranda had told her assistant, it had been enough to shift Sarah from guardian to tentative ally. At precisely 10 o'clock, Daniel made his way to the executive floor. He'd been up here exactly twice in his 2 years at Morrison and Lynch, once for his initial interview, once for a company-wide meeting. The space was different from the analyst's bullpen, all glass walls and expensive furniture, and the particular quiet of power consolidated. Sarah waved him through to Miranda's office without preamble. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Daniel found himself in a space that was pure Miranda, modern, elegant, meticulously organized. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Manhattan that probably cost more per square foot than his entire apartment. Miranda sat behind her desk in full CEO armor, the woman who'd made chocolate chip pancakes for his daughter completely hidden beneath professional polish. "Daniel, thank you for coming up." Her tone was formal, appropriate for an assistant who might be listening through the intercom, but her eyes softened slightly when they met his. "Please, sit." Daniel took one of the chairs facing her desk, hyper-aware of the corporate theater they were performing. This was the careful dance they'd have to master, public professionalism that hid private partnership. "I wanted to brief you on Tuesday's dinner," Miranda said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Guest list, seating arrangements, key talking points for the clients. Julian will be there with his date, seated strategically to maximize visibility." Daniel opened the folder, scanning names and corporate affiliations. The guest list read like a who's who of New York financial services. Senior partners, managing directors, the kind of people who made decisions worth millions before breakfast. "Where are we seated?" he asked. "Together, obviously, but I've placed us with Sandra Kim from First Harbor Capital and her husband. Sandra's been a client for 5 years, knows me well enough to ask pointed questions, but professionally enough not to make a scene." Miranda's expression was carefully controlled. She'll be our first real test. If we can convince Sandra we're genuinely together, we can convince anyone. What does she know about your history with Julian? Enough to be suspicious of sudden new relationships. She watched me get engaged to Julian at a similar event. Will remember that I presented it as a careful business partnership more than a love match. Miranda's fingers drummed once against her desk before she stilled them. She'll be looking for authenticity, for signs that this is different. Daniel thought about the weekend, about Emma's easy affection and the chocolate chip pancakes, and the way Miranda had looked reading bedtime stories in his modest apartment. Then we give her authenticity, within reason. Which means we don't perform grand romance. We show up comfortable with each other, like two people who've been quietly spending time together and are navigating going public. Occasional touches, inside jokes that feel organic, the small intimacies that develop when people are actually getting to know each other. Miranda studied him with something that might have been surprise. You've thought about this. I had a long Sunday night after Emma asked if you were going to be her new mommy. The color drained from Miranda's face. She asked what? Apparently she's building her own narrative about what you mean to us. I explained that you're someone I'm spending time with, but that nothing is changing with our family structure. But Miranda, we have to be more careful. Emma's attaching faster than I anticipated. I'm sorry, I tried to maintain distance, but she's very persuasive, and I didn't want to hurt her feelings. I know. It's not your fault. But it means we need to think about what happens when this ends, how we're going to explain it to her in a way that doesn't feel like another abandonment. Miranda was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer. Maybe we don't have to think about the ending yet. Maybe we just focus on getting through Tuesday, and then we reassess. That's not a plan. That's avoidance. Maybe avoidance is all I can handle right now. Miranda stood, moving to the window to look out over the city. I spent 6 months trying to handle Julian quietly, trying to maintain appearances while he slowly tightened his control. And then you offered me a way out, and I took it without fully thinking through the consequences. For you, for Emma, for any of us. Daniel joined her at the window, maintaining professional distance while speaking quietly enough that no one outside could hear. We're already in it, and you were right yesterday. Backing out now just gives Julian more ammunition. So we move forward, we're smart about it, and we protect Emma as much as we can. How did you get so calm about impossible situations? Practice. Single parenthood is basically a masterclass in navigating chaos. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. You learn to make decisions with incomplete information and hope you don't break anything too badly. Miranda turned to look at him, and in the morning light streaming through her windows, Daniel saw the exhaustion she'd been hiding beneath CEO competence. I'm not used to having help, not used to trusting anyone with the messy parts. I know, but you trusted me Friday night, and we made it through the weekend. We can make it through Tuesday, too. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Sarah's voice came through the intercom. Miss Wolf, you have the board call in 5 minutes. Thank you, Sarah. Miranda's mask slipped back into place, the vulnerable woman disappearing behind professional armor. I'll see you Tuesday, Daniel. 6:30. I'll send a car to your apartment. I can take the subway. You'll arrive in a car befitting my partner, not public transportation. This is about presentation as much as presence. Miranda's tone brooked no argument, the CEO who ran a billion-dollar company asserting authority. Wear the suit the tailor will deliver tomorrow. Sarah has your measurements from HR. Daniel nodded, recognizing the shift back to corporate dynamics. Yes, ma'am. Something flickered in Miranda's expression at the formal address, but she didn't comment. Daniel left, passing Sarah's desk on his way out. The assistant watched him with careful assessment, and Daniel wondered what she saw. The analyst who'd stumbled into complicated territory, or something more concerning. Back at his desk, Daniel found a stack of files waiting with a note from his supervisor. Read. Need these analyzed by end of day. No exceptions. The message was clear enough. Whatever personal situation Daniel had gotten himself into, it wouldn't excuse him from his regular responsibilities. If anything, he'd be held to a higher standard now, every project scrutinized for signs of preferential treatment. He settled into work, letting the familiar rhythms of financial analysis ground him. Numbers didn't care about gossip or corporate politics. Balance sheets didn't shift based on who you were dating. There was comfort in the objectivity of it, the clear right and wrong answers that life so rarely provided. The day passed in a blur of spreadsheets and skeptical colleagues. Daniel kept his head down, did his work, and deflected the subtle questions that came his way with polite deflection. By 5:30, when most of the office had cleared out, he was finishing the last of the analysis with the grim satisfaction of someone proving they could still perform under pressure. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Emma asking when you're picking up. Also asking about Miranda. We should talk. Daniel's stomach sank. He'd hoped to have more time before having to address Emma's questions with her daycare director, the woman who'd seen them through Rachel's death and Emma's difficult adjustment. Mrs. Chen would have opinions about introducing new people into Emma's life, opinions that would be both valid and challenging to navigate. He texted back, "Be there in 20 mins. Happy to talk tomorrow if you have time." The response came immediately. Tomorrow at drop-off, 8 a.m. sharp. Daniel arrived at the daycare to find Emma in the reading corner, her favorite spot when she was processing complicated emotions. Mrs. Chen met him at the door with an expression that promised the morning conversation would be thorough and potentially uncomfortable. "Daddy!" Emma ran to him, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. "I made a picture for Randa at art time. Can we give it to her?" Daniel took the picture, a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands, labeled Daddy, Emma, and Randa, in Emma's careful kindergarten printing. His heart sank at the evidence of how deeply Miranda had already embedded herself in his daughter's imagination. "That's beautiful, baby. We'll save it for the next time we see Miranda, okay? When's that? Tomorrow?" "Not tomorrow. I have a work dinner Tuesday night, remember? You're staying with Mrs. Chen." Emma's face fell, but she nodded with the resignation of a child who'd learned that adult schedules often trumped her preferences. They walked home through the autumn evening, Emma chattering about school, while Daniel tried to figure out how to explain Miranda's presence in their lives without building expectations that would inevitably crumble. Tuesday arrived with the inevitability of deadlines and difficult conversations. Daniel spent the morning at work trying to focus while his anxiety built toward evening. The suit arrived at noon, delivered by courier to Morrison & Lynch's mailroom. Charcoal gray, impeccably tailored, probably worth more than Daniel's monthly rent. The accompanying note from Sarah was brief. "Ms. Wolf requests you change in the executive washroom, 6th floor, code 4782. Car will collect you at 6:15 from the main entrance." Marcus was passing by when the courier arrived, and his expression soured at the sight of the garment bag. "Nice suit, Reed. Must be convenient, having a girlfriend who can expense your wardrobe." "It's for a client dinner," Daniel said evenly. "Dress code is formal." "Right, client dinner." Marcus's tone made it clear what he thought of that explanation. "Just remember, when this arrangement ends and you're looking for your next position, that suit won't protect you from the reputation you're building." The threat was thinly veiled. Marcus was already planning how to use Daniel's relationship with Miranda against him, whether through corporate channels or industry gossip. Daniel filed the information away as confirmation that he'd need to be twice as good at his job to overcome the skepticism his personal life had generated. At 6 o'clock, Daniel changed in the executive washroom as instructed. The suit fit perfectly, expensive fabric moving with him in ways his off-the-rack clothing never had. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Polished, professional, someone who might actually belong at a high-stakes client dinner with New York's financial elite. His phone buzzed with a text from Miranda. "Car's waiting. See you soon." The town car that collected him was sleek and dark, the kind of vehicle that whispered wealth without shouting it. The driver opened the door without comment, and Daniel slid into leather seats that probably cost more than his couch. His phone buzzed again, this time from Mrs. Chen confirming that Emma was settled in for the evening. The mundane reminder of his actual life felt jarring against the luxury surrounding him. They drove to Miranda's building in the Upper East Side, the kind of address that showed up in architectural magazines and celebrity real estate sections. The doorman greeted the car with professional warmth, and Daniel was escorted through a lobby that looked like a museum to an elevator that required a key card for the penthouse floors. Miranda's apartment was everything Daniel had expected, and nothing he was prepared for. sprawling space, floor-to-ceiling windows, artwork that was probably original and certainly expensive. She stood in the living room in a deep blue dress that managed to be both elegant and understated, her hair swept up to reveal the graceful line of her neck. "You look terrified," Miranda observed, crossing to where he stood frozen in her entryway. "Your apartment is bigger than my entire building." "It's also emptier." Miranda gestured to the pristine space, beautiful and cold in its perfection. No crayon drawings on the walls, no blanket forts in the living room, no chocolate chip pancake negotiations at breakfast. The observation surprised Daniel, the hint of loneliness beneath Miranda's polished exterior. Before he could respond, she continued, "We should go. The reservation is for 7, and Sandra Kim is always punctual." The restaurant was exactly the kind of place Daniel had expected. Discreet entrance, hushed interior, the kind of service that anticipated needs before they were voiced. A man in an expensive suit stood as they entered the private dining room, and Daniel recognized Julian Cross immediately from the society pages and Miranda's descriptions. He was everything Daniel wasn't, tall where Daniel was average height, refined where Daniel was ordinary, radiating the particular confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place at any table. The woman beside him was stunning in the way of people who'd been beautiful their entire lives, her hand possessive on Julian's arm. But it was Julian's eyes that told the real story. They tracked Miranda with predatory focus, noting every detail of her appearance, the way she moved, where her attention landed. And when those eyes shifted to Daniel, they carried cold calculation and barely concealed contempt. This was the man who'd been stalking Miranda for months, who couldn't accept that she'd rejected him, who was using every social weapon at his disposal to maintain control. Daniel felt his spine straighten, some protective instinct rising to meet the challenge in Julian's gaze. Miranda's hand found his, her fingers lacing through his with surprising naturalness. "Ready?" she asked quietly. Daniel squeezed her hand, felt the slight tremor she was hiding from everyone else. "Ready?" They walked into the dining room together, and Daniel felt the weight of every gaze that tracked their entrance. Sandra Kim watched with sharp interest from across the room. Julian's companion looked bored and beautiful, and Julian himself stood with barely contained rage, masked as casual greeting. "Miranda," Julian said, his voice smooth and cultured, "how wonderful to see you. And this must be the analyst we've heard so much about." The emphasis on analyst was deliberate, a verbal marking of social distance. But Daniel had grown up being underestimated by men like Julian, had learned to navigate the particular condescension of inherited wealth toward earned achievement. "Daniel Reed," he said, extending his hand with calm confidence. "And you must be Julian Cross. Miranda's mentioned you." The handshake was another test of dominance, Julian's grip calculated to intimidate, but Daniel had nothing to prove through physical posturing. He matched the pressure exactly, held it for the socially appropriate duration, and released without ceremony. "All good things, I hope," Julian said, his smile sharp. "Mostly warnings," Miranda interjected smoothly, her hand still in Daniel's. "But then, you always did prefer being memorable to being kind." The barb landed, and Daniel saw Julian's mask slip for just a moment before reasserting itself. This was going to be a long dinner, Daniel realized, each course another round in the careful warfare of social one-upmanship. But Miranda's hand in his was steady now, her fear transmuting into something harder. They moved to their assigned seats, and Daniel prepared himself for the performance of his life, convincing New York's financial elite that he belonged at this table, in this world, beside this woman who was so far outside his ordinary existence that the gap should have been unbridgeable. Except maybe it wasn't. Maybe the weekend in Queens had shown them both that distance could be crossed, that the things that mattered, honesty, kindness, the courage to help someone drowning, transcended the artificial hierarchies of wealth and status. Sandra Kim smiled at them across the table, her eyes bright with curiosity and calculation. "Miranda, darling, you must introduce us to your companion properly. I'm dying to know how you two met." And so the real test began. Daniel felt Miranda's hand tighten imperceptibly on his as Sandra Kim's question hung in the air between introduction and interrogation. Across the table, Julian leaned back with the casual posture of someone watching a performance he expected to enjoy, his companion forgotten beside him. "We met at work, naturally. Miranda said, her voice carrying just the right note of warmth. Though it took some time before I really saw him. The answer was both true and strategic, acknowledging their professional connection while hinting at something deeper. Sandra's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose with interest. How intriguing! And what changed? What made you finally see Mr. Reed here? Daniel felt the weight of the table's attention shift to him, every person present calculating his worth, his suitability, his right to be sitting beside Miranda Wolfe. He thought about the careful answer he could give, the polished deflection that would satisfy curiosity without revealing truth. But then he remembered what he'd told Miranda in her office, that authenticity would be more convincing than performance. I think she saw me seeing her, Daniel said quietly. Really seeing her, not just the CEO or the reputation or the corporate presence, just the person beneath all that who sometimes needs help like anyone else. The honesty in his voice cut through the dinner party's practiced sophistication. Sandra's expression shifted from curiosity to something more thoughtful, while Julian's companion looked suddenly interested, as if she'd just noticed there was an actual human being at the table instead of another corporate accessory. Julian, however, barely contained his derision. How beautifully poetic. Though I have to wonder, Reed, what exactly a junior analyst sees in his CEO that the rest of us miss? The professional advancement opportunities? The access to circles typically closed to someone of your background? Miranda's free hand moved to the table, her fingers drumming once in barely suppressed anger. But Daniel squeezed her other hand gently, a silent message to let him handle this. I see someone, Daniel said evenly, meeting Julian's gaze without flinching, who's been managing an impossible situation with more grace than anyone should have to. Someone who needed a safe space and couldn't find it anywhere in her carefully constructed world. Someone brave enough to ask for help, even when asking meant risking everything she'd built. The words were layered with double meaning, addressing both their fictional romance and the very real stalking that had driven Miranda to create it. Julian's expression darkened as he caught the implication, but before he could respond, Sandra spoke. And you, Miranda? What do you see in Daniel that made you willing to risk the inevitable scrutiny this relationship will bring? It was a fair question, delivered without judgment, but weighted with genuine curiosity. Miranda looked at Daniel, and he saw her making the same calculation he had, whether to perform or to be honest within the bounds of their necessary fiction. I see someone who shows up, Miranda said simply. When I needed help, when anyone else would have walked away to protect themselves, he stayed. He's a single father raising a remarkable daughter, managing impossible schedules, and still finding the capacity to care about someone else's crisis. That's not something you find in corporate boardrooms very often. A single father? Julian's companion spoke for the first time, her interest clearly piqued. How old is your daughter? 5, Daniel answered. Emma. She's staying with our daycare director tonight, probably negotiating extended screen time and extra cookies. The mundane detail humanized him in a way that corporate credentials never could. Sandra smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her sophisticated assessment. My daughter is 7, she said. The cookie negotiations never end, they just get more sophisticated. Last week, Claire tried to convince me that fruit snacks count as vegetables because they're fruit-shaped. Laughter rippled around the table, the tension breaking slightly as the conversation shifted to the universal challenges of parenting. Daniel found himself relaxing marginally, discussing Emma's similar attempts at nutritional loophole exploitation. Even Julian's companion joined in, mentioning her niece's elaborate bedtime stalling tactics. But Julian himself remained silent, his eyes tracking every interaction between Daniel and Miranda with cold calculation. When the first course arrived, some delicate preparation that probably had a French name Daniel couldn't pronounce, Julian finally spoke again. So tell me, Reed, how does Morrison & Lynch's ethics policy address relationships between executives and their subordinates? I imagine there are protocols in place to prevent conflicts of interest. The question was designed to corner Daniel, to force him to either admit they'd violated policy or acknowledge that their relationship existed outside proper corporate channels. Miranda's jaw tightened, but Daniel kept his expression neutral. We disclosed the relationship to HR immediately, Daniel said, which was true as of yesterday morning when Miranda had filed the necessary paperwork. We've established clear boundaries to prevent any perception of favoritism. I maintain my current position and responsibilities. No special treatment, no professional advancement tied to our personal connection. Everything documented and transparent. How admirably thorough, Julian said, his tone suggesting the opposite. Though I have to wonder how one maintains professional distance when the power imbalance is so significant. Miranda controls your career, your income, your professional future. How does one separate personal from professional when your girlfriend could fire you with a single signature? The same way anyone in any relationship navigates power dynamics, Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. With honesty, clear communication, and mutual respect. Miranda doesn't abuse her authority, and I don't take advantage of our connection. It's not complicated unless someone chooses to make it complicated. Sandra's husband, who'd been quietly observing until now, spoke up. Seems to me the real question isn't about corporate policy, but about character. Either you trust that two adults can manage their personal and professional lives with integrity, or you don't. Julian, your skepticism seems rather pointed for someone who supposedly moved on 6 months ago. The observation landed like a grenade on the perfectly set table. Julian's mask cracked further, his cultured facade giving way to something uglier beneath. His companion shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware she was more prop than date in whatever game Julian was playing. I'm merely concerned for Miranda's reputation, Julian said, his voice tight. She's worked too hard to build her career to have it undermined by questionable personal choices that could be perceived as inappropriate by clients and board members. My personal choices are my own, Miranda said, her CEO voice emerging cold and final. And I don't require your concern, Julian. I never did. That was always the problem, wasn't it? You wanted to protect and manage and control when all I needed was to be trusted to make my own decisions. The conversation had shifted from dinner party small talk to something raw, the history between Miranda and Julian bleeding through the professional veneer. Daniel felt the table's attention riveted on the unfolding confrontation, could sense Sandra cataloging every word for future analysis. Julian leaned forward, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. I trusted you enough to propose, Miranda. Trusted you enough to build a future together. And you threw it away because you got cold feet about commitment. I ended it because I didn't love you, Miranda said quietly, her honesty cutting through Julian's narrative like a blade. Because I realized that building a life based on social convenience and professional networking wasn't enough. Because you wanted a partner who would be grateful for your attention and defer to your judgment, and I was never going to be that person. So instead you chose him? Julian's gesture toward Daniel was dismissive, contemptuous. An analyst with a used car and a studio apartment in Queens? Someone so far beneath your social sphere that bringing him to events like this is almost embarrassing? The insult was designed to humiliate both of them, to reduce Daniel to his modest circumstances and paint Miranda as someone slumming for rebellion's sake. Daniel felt the old familiar sting of class prejudice. The subtle and not so subtle ways that inherited wealth marked certain people as lesser. But before he could respond, Miranda stood, her movement sharp and decisive. The entire table froze, caught in the sudden shift from dinner conversation to something more significant. Daniel has more integrity in his worn jacket pockets than you've ever possessed in your custom suits, Miranda said, her voice carrying across the private dining room. He's a better father in his modest apartment than you'd ever be in your family's mansions. He saw me drowning and helped me without asking for anything in return, without leveraging my vulnerability, without trying to control or possess me. That's not beneath my social sphere, Julian. That's far above yours. The silence that followed was absolute. Sandra's eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been admiration. Julian's companion looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. And Julian himself sat frozen, his rage barely contained beneath layers of forced civility. Daniel stood, moving to Miranda's side. His hand found the small of her back, a gesture of support and solidarity that he hoped looked natural to their audience. I think we should go, he said quietly to Miranda, then turned to address the table. Sandra, I apologize for disrupting your evening. This clearly isn't the right venue for personal matters to be addressed. Sandra recovered her composure with impressive speed. No apology necessary. Though Miranda, we should schedule lunch soon. I'd like to hear more about these new developments in your life when we're not competing with quite so much drama. The suggestion was both professional courtesy and genuine interest, a lifeline thrown across the wreckage of the dinner party. Miranda nodded, her hand finding Daniel's with desperate intensity. They made their exit with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances, the restaurant staff appearing from nowhere to facilitate their departure. The town car was waiting, and they slid into its leather interior with the synchronized movement of people fleeing a disaster. For the first 3 blocks, neither of them spoke. Miranda stared out the window at Manhattan's glittering nightscape, her breathing carefully controlled in the way of someone holding back tears through sheer force of will. Daniel sat beside her, processing what had just happened, the spectacular implosion of their carefully planned public appearance. "I'm sorry," Miranda finally said, her voice rough. "I lost control. I let him get to me and I made a scene, and I probably just destroyed any chance of this arrangement working." "You defended both of us," Daniel corrected. "You stood up to a man who's been terrorizing you for months. That's not losing control, that's finding it." "I called attention to exactly what we were trying to downplay, the power imbalance, the class difference, the professional complications. Julian will use every word I said as ammunition. By tomorrow, half of New York's financial sector will have heard about the CEO who had a public meltdown defending her inappropriate relationship with a subordinate." Daniel heard the panic creeping into her voice, the CEO brain catastrophizing all the potential fallout. He reached for her hand, pulling her attention back from the spiral. "Or," he said quietly, "they'll hear about a CEO who stood up to her abusive ex-fiancé and made it clear she won't tolerate his manipulation. Miranda, you were magnificent in there. Terrifying, but magnificent." A sound escaped her that was half laugh, half sob. "I've never done that before. Lost my temper in public, said exactly what I was thinking without filtering for professional consequences. It was completely out of character." "Maybe your character needed to expand a little. Maybe being perfectly controlled all the time was part of what made you vulnerable to Julian's tactics." Miranda turned to look at him, and in the dim light of the car's interior, Daniel saw tears tracking down her carefully made-up face. "He was insulting you, calling you beneath me, dismissing your worth based on your bank account and your zip code, and something just broke. I couldn't sit there and let him reduce you to a stereotype when I've seen who you actually are." The confession hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them was ready to fully examine. Daniel reached up, gently wiping away her tears with his thumb, aware that this small intimacy crossed some invisible line from performance into reality. "You don't have to defend my worth to people like Julian," Daniel said softly. "I know who I am. I know what I've survived, what I've built, what I'm capable of. His opinion doesn't change any of that. But it matters what people think, what the board thinks, what our clients think. It matters what you think," Daniel interrupted. "What you believe about yourself, about us, about whether you're strong enough to weather whatever consequences come from tonight. Everything else is just noise." Miranda stared at him, and Daniel watched something shift in her expression. The CEO mask was completely gone now, stripped away by the evening's confrontation, leaving only the woman beneath, vulnerable and scared and desperately trying to hold herself together. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she admitted. "Julian's been in my head for months, making me doubt myself, second-guess every decision. And tonight, standing up to him felt powerful, but now I'm terrified of what comes next." "What comes next is we go home," Daniel said. "You process what happened. I check on Emma and make sure she's okay. And tomorrow we deal with whatever fallout arrives. But Miranda, you don't have to face it alone anymore. That was the whole point of this arrangement, remember? Shared burden, mutual support." "This wasn't supposed to become real," Miranda whispered. "We were supposed to maintain careful distance, perform for public consumption, protect ourselves from actual emotional investment. But Emma draws pictures of me, and you see me crying in the back of town cars, and somehow this fiction became something else." Daniel felt the truth of her words settle in his chest. Somewhere between chocolate chip pancakes and blanket forts and tonight's explosive dinner, their arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had planned for. Something more honest and more dangerous than a simple business agreement. "I know," he said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. I know it's complicated and messy and probably going to end badly for all of us. But right now, in this moment, I'm glad you're not facing Julian alone. I'm glad I could stand beside you tonight, even if it all went sideways. Miranda leaned her head against his shoulder, the gesture so natural it took them both by surprise. Daniel felt her breathing gradually slow as she borrowed his calm, the way Emma did when nightmares woke her, and she needed his steady presence to feel safe again. They rode the rest of the way to Miranda's building in silence, the city's endless energy flowing past the windows while they sat in their own quiet bubble. When the car stopped, Miranda didn't immediately move. "Thank you," she said finally, "for tonight, for not walking away when Julian started attacking, for defending us even when it would have been easier to stay silent." "You're welcome." Miranda pulled back to look at him, and Daniel saw the question forming before she asked it. "Do you want to come up?" "Not for anything, just I don't want to be alone right now, and my apartment feels very empty after spending the weekend at your place." Every rational instinct Daniel possessed screamed at him to decline. He needed to check on Emma, needed to process the evening's events, needed to maintain whatever boundaries still existed between performance and reality. But he looked at Miranda's tear-stained face and remembered what it felt like in the months after Rachel died, when the apartment was too quiet and the bed was too empty and the loneliness was a physical ache. "One drink," he heard himself say, "and then I need to get home to Emma." They took the elevator to her penthouse, the space even more intimidating at night with the city's lights creating a glittering backdrop. Miranda kicked off her heels immediately, the loss of height making her seem smaller, more vulnerable. She poured them both whiskey from a crystal decanter that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly grocery budget. "To spectacular failures," Miranda said, raising her glass with bitter humor. "To standing your ground," Daniel countered, and they drank. The whiskey burned going down, expensive and smooth in a way that Daniel's usual beer never approached. Miranda curled into the corner of her pristine couch, and Daniel noticed for the first time how staged her apartment looked. Like a magazine spread, beautiful but unlived in. No photos on the walls, no personal touches, nothing that spoke to the actual woman who supposedly inhabited this space. "When I bought this place," Miranda said, following his gaze, "I told myself it represented success. The culmination of everything I'd worked for, but it's just expensive emptiness, isn't it? A very pretty cage that I convinced myself was freedom." "It doesn't have to be," Daniel said. "You could make it yours. Put up photos, bring in things that matter to you, let it get a little messy and lived in." "I don't know what matters to me anymore," Miranda admitted. "I spent so long building my career, maintaining my image, managing my public persona, that I forgot to build a life underneath it all. And then you showed me your apartment with Emma's drawings everywhere, and the fort made of blankets, and I realized what I've been missing." Daniel heard the loneliness in her voice, the exhaustion of maintaining perfection. It's not too late to change that, to start building something real instead of something that just looks good from the outside. "Is that what we're doing?" Miranda asked quietly. "Building something real? Or are we just two people using each other to fill the empty spaces in our lives?" The question was too honest, cutting too close to fears Daniel had been avoiding since Sunday morning. He thought about Emma's picture with 3 stick figures, about the way his daughter had asked if Miranda would be her new mommy, about how seamlessly Miranda had integrated into their weekend routine. "I don't know," Daniel said, "because anything else would have been a lie. I know this started as an arrangement, a mutual agreement to solve immediate problems. But I also know that watching you read to Emma felt right in a way nothing has since Rachel died. And standing beside you tonight, facing down Julian together, that felt like partnership instead of performance." "But we have an end date, Miranda reminded him, her voice pained. "We agreed this would be temporary, just long enough to convince Julian to move on. What happens when that timeline arrives and Emma's already attached and I've gotten used to chocolate chip pancakes and family dinners?" "I don't know," Daniel repeated, the uncertainty heavy between them. "Maybe we're both terrible at maintaining boundaries. Maybe we're rushing into emotional territory we're not prepared for. Or maybe sometimes the right thing arrives at the wrong time, and you have to decide whether to run from it or figure out how to make it work." Miranda set down her glass and moved closer, her eyes searching his face. "I'm scared, Daniel. Scared of Julian and what he might do next. Scared of the fallout from tonight's dinner." Scared of what I'm starting to feel for you and Emma and this life you've built that's so different from mine. I don't know how to navigate any of this. Daniel thought about all the careful speeches he could give about taking things slowly, maintaining professional distance, protecting Emma from complicated adult emotions. But he was tired of careful, tired of performing, tired of pretending that something fundamental hadn't shifted in the space of 5 days. Then we figure it out together, he said quietly. Scared and uncertain and probably making mistakes, but together. No more pretending this is just an arrangement, no more maintaining distance that neither of us actually wants. We acknowledge it's messy and complicated, and we navigate it one day at a time. What about Emma? What about protecting her from getting hurt when this might not work out? Emma's already attached. That ship sailed somewhere between the park visit and the blanket fort construction. So we're honest with her, age-appropriately honest, about the fact that Miranda and I are spending time together and figuring things out. And if it doesn't work, we handle it with as much care as possible. Miranda was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel watched her cycle through calculations and concerns, the CEO brain trying to find the angle, the risk assessment, the safe path forward. But then something in her expression shifted, fear giving way to something that looked almost like hope. Okay, she said softly. Okay, we try this for real. No more fiction, no more performance. Just two people who met in terrible circumstances and somehow found something worth protecting. Okay, Daniel echoed, and felt the ground shift beneath them as arrangement became relationship, as temporary became possible future, as careful distance collapsed into acknowledged connection. They talked for another hour, finishing the whiskey and mapping out a path forward that felt impossible and necessary. Daniel would talk to Emma tomorrow, explain that he and Miranda were dating for real now, prepare his daughter for the possibility that this woman might become a more permanent fixture. Miranda would handle the professional fallout from tonight's dinner, meet with HR again, ensure their relationship was documented and above board despite the chaos. When Daniel finally stood to leave, exhaustion settling into his bones, Miranda walked him to the door. They stood in her elegant entryway, the space between them charged with new awareness and acknowledged possibility. Thank you, Miranda said, for not letting me face tonight alone, for standing with me even when it got ugly. That's what partners do, Daniel replied, testing the word, feeling it settle into place with surprising rightness. Miranda smiled, genuine warmth breaking through the evening's tension. Partners? I like that better than arrangement. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Emma sleeping peacefully. She was very good tonight. See you in the morning for our talk. The reminder of real life waiting beyond Miranda's penthouse grounded him. I should go. Emma duty starts early, and I have a feeling Mrs. Chen's conversation tomorrow is going to be thorough. What will you tell her? The truth mostly, that I'm seeing someone, that it's new and complicated, and that I'm trying to be careful with Emma's heart while also not denying myself the possibility of happiness. Daniel reached for Miranda's hand, the gesture feeling natural now. She'll have opinions. Mrs. Chen always has opinions, but she'll also see that Emma's been happier this week than she has in months. Because of the pancakes in the fort? Because of you, Daniel corrected gently. Because you showed up in our lives and treated Emma like a person worth knowing, not just an obligation to tolerate. That matters more than you realize. Miranda's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. I'm going to try very hard not to let either of you down. We're going to try very hard not to let you down too, Daniel said. That's how this works. Mutual effort, shared risk, figuring it out together. He left before either of them could complicate the moment further, riding the elevator down to street level and stepping out into Manhattan's late-night energy. The subway ride back to Queens gave him time to process everything, the dinner, the confrontation, the shift from arrangement to actual relationship. By the time he reached his apartment building, it was past 11, and Daniel felt the exhaustion of the evening settling into his muscles. Inside, the apartment was exactly as he'd left it. Emma's toys scattered across the living room, dishes from breakfast still in the sink, the comfortable chaos of his actual life. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, aware that he'd just committed to bringing Miranda deeper into this world, to letting her see not just the weekend highlights, but the daily grind of single parenthood and modest living. He cleaned up quietly, putting away toys and washing dishes, the familiar routine grounding him. His phone buzzed with a text from Miranda. Made it home safe? The question was simple but weighted with new meaning. Girlfriend checking on boyfriend, not CEO monitoring employee. Daniel smiled despite his exhaustion. Just got in. Apartment feels different without you and Emma building forts in the living room. The response came quickly. Good different or bad different? Daniel thought about how to answer honestly. Quieter, lonelier. Like I got used to not being alone in the space of a weekend. I know the feeling. My apartment is too big and too quiet, and I keep thinking about Emma's crayon drawing and your terrible bear voices during story time. The bear voices are excellent, thank you very much. They're terrible. Emma just loves you too much to tell you. The easy banter felt right. Felt like the beginning of something that could actually work if they were both brave enough to try. Daniel sent back a smiley face, aware that he was 41 years old and texting emojis to his girlfriend like a teenager, and not caring. Get some sleep, Miranda texted. Tomorrow you have Mrs. Chen's interrogation, and I have damage control from tonight's spectacular meltdown. It wasn't a meltdown. It was a declaration of independence. That's a generous interpretation, but I'll take it. Good night, Daniel. Good night, Miranda. Daniel set his phone aside and finally collapsed onto his bed. The bed Miranda had slept in just days ago, the space still carrying the ghost of her presence. He thought about Julian's furious face, about Sandra Kim's calculating interest, about the way Miranda had stood up and defended him with such fierce conviction. He thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully at Mrs. Chen's place, unaware that her father was trying to navigate impossible complications while protecting her heart. Thought about the conversation they'd need to have tomorrow, explaining that Miranda wasn't just a weekend visitor anymore, that she might become something more permanent and important. The risks were enormous. The complications already evident. The possibility of failure and heartbreak and Emma experiencing another loss loomed over everything. But Daniel had learned in the 18 months since Rachel's death that safety wasn't the same as living, that protecting yourself from pain also meant closing yourself off from joy. Miranda Wolfe had stumbled into his life desperate and terrified, and somewhere in the chaos of their arrangement, they'd found something worth protecting. It was messy and complicated and probably doomed to spectacular failure. But it was also real and honest, and the first time since Rachel's death that Daniel had allowed himself to hope for something beyond mere survival. He fell asleep thinking about chocolate chip pancakes and blanket forts and the way Miranda's hand had felt in his when they'd faced down Julian Cross together. Whatever came next, professional fallout, corporate scrutiny, the challenge of blending their wildly different worlds, they'd face it together. That had to count for something. That had to be enough to justify the risk they were both taking. In her penthouse across the city, Miranda stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the glittering Manhattan skyline. Somewhere in that sprawl of lights was Daniel's modest apartment in Queens, Emma sleeping peacefully, a life built on love instead of luxury. Tomorrow would bring consequences from tonight's dinner. Julian would retaliate, the gossip would spread. The board might have questions about their CEO's personal drama spilling into professional spaces. But for the first time in months, Miranda felt something that might have been peace. She'd stood up to Julian, had chosen honesty over performance, had defended the man who'd offered her safety without asking for anything in return. And in doing so, had maybe started building something real beneath the carefully constructed facade of her corporate existence. Her phone buzzed with a final text from Daniel. Emma's picture for you is on my fridge. She's very proud of it. Says you need to see it next time you visit. Miranda smiled, genuine warmth flooding through her chest. Tell her I can't wait to see it, and that she's an excellent artist. Will do. Now seriously, get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be interesting. That's one word for it. Sweet dreams, Daniel. She set her phone aside and moved through her too big, too empty apartment, finally understanding what had been missing. It wasn't more success or higher achievement or perfect control. It was connection, messy and complicated and real. It was Emma's crayon drawings and Daniel's steady presence, and the possibility that family could be chosen instead of inherited. Tomorrow would bring complications. Tonight, she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, they could actually make this work. Wednesday morning arrived with Mrs. Chen's pointed expression and a conversation Daniel had been dreading since he'd picked Emma up the night before. He dropped his daughter off at daycare precisely at 8, watching her skip toward the play area with the resilience of children who processed complicated emotions through movement and imagination. "Mr. Reed," Mrs. Chen said, her tone carrying the particular weight of someone who'd watched him stumble through early widowhood and now had concerns about his next chapter. "My office, please." Daniel followed her into the small room that served as administrative center and occasional counseling space for parents navigating the chaos of raising children in New York. Mrs. Chen settled behind her desk with the authority of someone who'd seen every parenting mistake imaginable and had strong opinions about all of them. "Emma has been talking about Miranda non-stop," Mrs. Chen began without preamble. "Miranda this, Miranda that. When is Miranda coming back? And yesterday she asked me if having a new friend for her daddy meant she was getting a new mommy." The words hit Daniel exactly where Mrs. Chen intended. "I'm handling it. I talked to Emma about not building expectations, about Miranda being someone I'm spending time with, but that our family structure isn't changing." And yet she drew a picture of 3 people holding hands with your names labeled. She's already integrated this woman into her concept of family, Daniel. That's not careful boundary management. That's attachment. "I know." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, the exhaustion of the past week settling into his bones. "I know Emma's attaching faster than I anticipated, but Mrs. Chen, she's been happier this week than she has in months. She's sleeping better. The nightmares have decreased. She's engaging more at school. Miranda's presence has been good for her." "Until it isn't," Mrs. Chen countered, her voice gentler now. "Until this relationship ends and Emma experiences another loss, another person who was present and then disappeared. You know how fragile she still is, how much work we've done to help her process her mother's death. Are you really willing to risk undoing that progress for a relationship that's what? A week old?" The criticism stung because it was valid. Daniel had been so focused on helping Miranda, on navigating the immediate crisis of Julian's stalking, that he'd perhaps not fully considered the long-term implications for Emma's emotional stability. "It's not just a week old," Daniel said quietly. "The public relationship is new, but Miranda and I have been growing closer for longer than that. And yes, there's risk. There's always risk in letting new people into Emma's life. But the alternative is what? Never dating, never allowing myself the possibility of partnership, teaching Emma that love is so dangerous we should avoid it entirely?" Mrs. Chen studied him with the sharp assessment of someone who'd known him through his worst moments. "I'm not saying never date. I'm saying be more careful about who you bring into Emma's world and how quickly you integrate them. This woman, Miranda, she's your boss, yes? The CEO of your company? Yes? And you don't see potential complications there? Power dynamics, professional consequences, the risk that if this relationship ends badly, you lose both your partner and your livelihood?" "Of course I see the complications," Daniel said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'm not naive, Mrs. Chen. I know this situation is messy and risky and probably going to end badly. But I'm also 41 years old, and I've spent 18 months in survival mode, and for the first time since Rachel died, I'm allowing myself to feel something beyond grief and responsibility." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "I'm not the enemy here, Daniel. I'm the person who watched you barely function in those first months after Rachel's death, who saw you learn to braid Emma's hair from YouTube videos and figure out how to pack kindergarten lunches and navigate parent-teacher conferences alone. I've watched you rebuild your life one small piece at a time, and I don't want to see that progress destroyed by a relationship that moves too fast and crashes too hard." Daniel felt the truth of her concern, the genuine care beneath the criticism. "What do you suggest?" "Slow down. Maintain some boundaries between your dating life and Emma's daily routine. Let this relationship develop without making Emma a central part of it until you're certain it's stable and long-term." Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her voice earnest. "I know Emma likes Miranda. I know she's been happier, but Emma would be happy with anyone who paid attention to her and made pancakes and built forts. Her happiness can't be the only metric you use to evaluate whether this relationship is healthy for her." The observation landed hard because it articulated something Daniel had been avoiding. He'd been using Emma's joy as justification for accelerating a relationship that maybe needed more time to develop privately before becoming a family affair. "You're right," Daniel admitted. "I've been moving too fast, letting Emma get too involved too quickly. I'll talk to Miranda about maintaining more separation between our relationship and Emma's routine." "Good. And Daniel, I hope it works out. I really do. You deserve happiness, and Emma deserves to see her father in a healthy, loving relationship. I just want you both to be protected if it doesn't." Daniel left the conversation feeling chastened and uncertain. He'd been so focused on the immediate crisis, helping Miranda escape Julian's stalking, navigating corporate politics, managing public perception, that he'd perhaps lost sight of the most important consideration, his daughter's emotional well-being. At work, the fallout from Tuesday's dinner was already evident. Daniel walked into Morrison and Lynch to find Marcus Webb holding court near the coffee station, his voice carrying across the open floor plan. Apparently she had a complete meltdown at Meridian, started yelling at Julian Cross in front of half the financial district's power players. Very stable, very professional leadership. Several analysts clustered around Marcus laughed, and Daniel felt his jaw tighten. But before he could decide whether to confront the gossip or ignore it, Sarah Chen appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Reed, Ms. Wolfe would like to see you in her office immediately." The formal summons drew every eye in the vicinity. Marcus's smirk widened, clearly interpreting this as evidence that Daniel was about to be reprimanded for the dinner's spectacular failure. Daniel followed Sarah to the elevator, aware of the whispers tracking his departure. In Miranda's office, he found her behind her desk in full CEO armor, but her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night managing crisis communications. The moment Sarah closed the door, Miranda's facade cracked slightly. "How bad is it?" Daniel asked. "Manageable. Barely." Miranda gestured to a chair, and Daniel sat while she pulled up something on her computer. "Sandra Kim called this morning. She wants to schedule lunch to discuss what she delicately called the evolving dynamics of your leadership style." That sounds ominous. "It's actually better than I expected." Sandra's tone was more curious than concerned. "I think she's trying to figure out if I've had some kind of breakdown, or if I'm finally standing up for myself after years of performing perfect composure." Miranda rubbed her temples, stress evident in the gesture. Julian, however, has been busy. He's already reached out to 3 board members expressing concern about my emotional stability and judgment. Daniel felt anger flare hot in his chest. "He's using Tuesday night to undermine you professionally." "Of course he is. That's always been his strategy. Make me look unstable, irrational, too emotional to lead effectively. The fact that I publicly defended you, my subordinate boyfriend, just gives him more ammunition." Miranda met Daniel's eyes, and he saw fear beneath her professional mask. "The board is calling an emergency meeting Friday to discuss Tuesday's incident and its implications for Morrison and Lynch's leadership." The implications were clear. Julian was trying to force Miranda out, using their relationship and her emotional response as evidence that she was unfit for her position. Daniel thought about Mrs. Chen's warnings, about Emma's attachment, about all the ways this situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. "What do you need from me?" he asked quietly. "Honestly, I don't know. Part of me thinks we should end this now, publicly announce it was a mistake, give the board nothing to question, but that just confirms Julian's narrative that I'm unstable and impulsive. Or," Daniel said slowly, "we do the opposite. We present a united front, show the board that this relationship is serious and managed with complete professional integrity. We document everything, prove there's been no favoritism or impropriety, and make it clear that Julian's objections are about personal revenge, not legitimate corporate concerns." Miranda looked at him with something between hope and disbelief. "You're suggesting we double down after the disaster of Tuesday night?" "I'm suggesting we stop letting Julian control the narrative. He wants you scared and defensive. So we be confident and transparent instead. We show the board that yes, we're in a relationship, but it's being handled appropriately and doesn't impact your ability to lead Morrison and Lynch. That's a huge risk for you. If the board decides I'm compromised, they might force you out as part of cleaning up the situation. Then they force me out, and I find another position. But Miranda, we can't keep making decisions based on fear of what Julian might do. At some point, we have to stand our ground and trust that honesty and integrity matter more than his manipulation." Miranda was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel watched her cycle through calculations and concerns. Finally, she nodded. Okay, we prepare a presentation for the board. Full disclosure about our relationship, documentation of all HR protocols we've followed, clear boundaries we've established. And we make it very clear that Julian Cross has been stalking me for months and is using this relationship as an excuse to undermine my position. You're going to accuse him publicly? I'm going to tell the truth publicly. I have texts, voicemails, documented instances of him showing up at events uninvited. I've been managing this quietly because I was afraid of the professional fallout, but maybe it's time to stop being afraid. Daniel heard the echo of his own words to Emma about bravery, about not letting fear make all your decisions. Okay, we do this together. What do you need from me? They spent the next hour strategizing, pulling together documentation, and preparing talking points. Sarah brought them coffee and legal files, her efficiency suggesting she'd already anticipated this crisis and had begun preparing for it. By 11, they had the framework of a defense that felt both honest and strategic. I need to tell you something, Daniel said as they were wrapping up. I talked to Mrs. Chen this morning. She's concerned about how quickly Emma's getting attached, about the risks to her emotional stability if this relationship doesn't work out. Miranda's expression shifted to guilt immediately. She's right. I've been so focused on my own crisis that I haven't fully considered the impact on Emma. We should slow down, maintain more boundaries between our relationship and your family life. That's what Mrs. Chen suggested too. But Miranda, Emma's already attached. That ship sailed somewhere between the pancakes and the fort. We can try to create more separation going forward, but we can't undo what's already happened. So what do we do? Daniel thought about his daughter's picture with 3 stick figures, about her question regarding new mommies, about the way she'd asked when Miranda was coming back with such hopeful certainty. We're honest with her, age-appropriately honest. We tell her that you and I are dating, that we care about each other, but that adult relationships are complicated and we're figuring things out. We don't make promises about the future, but we also don't hide or pretend we're not building something real. And if it doesn't work, if the board forces you out or Julian escalates or we realize we're too different to make this sustainable, then we handle it with as much care as possible. We explain to Emma that sometimes adults try relationships that don't work out, and that it's sad but okay. We let her grieve if she needs to, and we help her understand that love is worth the risk, even when it's scary. Miranda moved around her desk to stand in front of Daniel, her hand finding his with familiar ease. You're very brave about this, about taking risks for connection when you've already lost so much. I'm terrified, Daniel corrected. But I learned something when Rachel died. Safety isn't the same as living. Protecting yourself from pain also means closing yourself off from joy. And Emma deserves to see that her dad is willing to be brave about building a life beyond survival. They stood together in Miranda's office, the city sprawling below them through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Daniel felt the weight of the choice they were making. To be honest instead of careful, to be brave instead of safe. To trust that integrity and connection mattered more than corporate politics and social manipulation. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation and crisis management. Daniel maintained his normal work responsibilities while also helping Miranda build their defense for Friday's board meeting. Emma continued asking about Miranda with persistent 5-year-old determination, and Daniel had the promised honest conversation about adult relationships and uncertainty and taking things one day at a time. But you like her a lot, right, Daddy? Emma had asked, her small face serious. I do like her a lot, Daniel had confirmed. And she likes us a lot too, but that doesn't mean we know what's going to happen next. We're just figuring it out together. Emma had seemed satisfied with this explanation, her resilience showing in how quickly she'd moved on to discussing her stuffed animal's complex social dynamics. But Daniel knew the conversation wasn't finished, that Emma would continue processing this development in her own time and way. Thursday evening, Miranda came to the apartment for dinner. It was different from the weekend's emergency shelter situation, more deliberate, more like an actual date. She brought flowers and wine, and Emma greeted her with enthusiastic hugs and immediate demands for fort construction. Can we build an even bigger one? With more rooms, please? Miranda laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. Absolutely. But first, I want to see this picture you made for me. Your dad says it's been on the fridge all week. Emma dragged Miranda to the kitchen, pointing proudly at the crayon drawing. See? That's you, and that's Daddy, and that's me. We're holding hands because we're friends. Daniel watched Miranda study the picture, saw emotion flash across her face before she controlled it. It's beautiful, Emma. Can I keep it? I'd like to put it in my office. Really? In your big fancy office? Really? It'll remind me of pancakes and forts and the best weekend I've had in a very long time. They built the fort together, all three of them, creating an elaborate structure that took over most of the living room. Emma directed the construction with the authority of a general, and Daniel and Miranda followed her commands with exaggerated seriousness that made her dissolve into giggles. After dinner, spaghetti that Emma insisted on helping cook, resulting in sauce on multiple surfaces. Miranda stayed for bedtime stories, but this time, when Emma asked her to read, Miranda gently deflected. I think tonight should be just you and your dad. I'll see you again soon, but some things are special for just the two of you. The boundary was small but significant, a recognition that Emma needed to maintain her primary attachment to Daniel, even as Miranda became more present in their lives. Emma accepted this with surprising grace, settling against Daniel for their nightly ritual while Miranda watched from the doorway. After Emma was asleep, Daniel and Miranda sat on the couch with coffee and the comfortable quiet of people learning to be together without performing. Tomorrow's the board meeting, Miranda said, her fingers wrapped around her mug like it was anchoring her. I'm terrified. You're going to be brilliant. You've built an airtight case, documented everything, prepared for every possible question. And if they decide I'm still too much of a liability, if they force me to choose between my position and our relationship? Daniel had thought about this possibility extensively over the past few days. Then you make whatever choice feels right for you. I won't be the reason you lose something you've worked your entire career to build. What if the right choice is keeping both? What if I refuse to let Julian's manipulation cost me either my career or my relationship? Then you fight for both, and I'll stand beside you while you do. Miranda set down her coffee and turned to face him fully. I need to tell you something. Something I've been avoiding saying because it makes this whole situation even more complicated. Daniel braced himself, uncertain what confession was coming. I'm falling for you, Miranda said quietly. Not performing falling for you, not arrangement falling for you. Actually falling for you, for your terrible bear voices and your chocolate chip pancakes and the way you parent Emma with such fierce devotion, for your integrity and your calm in crisis, and the fact that you see me, really see me, not just the CEO armor. The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in their implications. Daniel felt his heart rate accelerate, felt the careful boundaries he'd been maintaining collapse completely. I'm falling for you too, he admitted. Have been since you defended me at that dinner, probably before. And it terrifies me because Emma's involved now and the stakes are so much higher than just my own heart. I know, and I promise I will do everything in my power not to hurt her, not to hurt either of you. But Daniel, I can't promise this works out perfectly. I can only promise I'm going to try with everything I have. That's all anyone can promise, Daniel said, reaching for her hand. The rest is just faith and effort and hoping we're brave enough to weather whatever comes next. They sat together in the quiet apartment, Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, and let themselves acknowledge what they'd been dancing around for days. This was real. This mattered. This was worth fighting for, even if the odds seemed impossible. Friday morning arrived with the weight of judgment and consequence. Daniel dressed carefully in the suit Miranda had provided, aware that he was armor himself for battle, even though he wouldn't be in the boardroom. Miranda had asked him to wait in her office during the meeting, close enough to provide support, but separate from the actual proceedings. The board meeting was scheduled for 10. At 9:30, Daniel watched Miranda prepare her materials with the focused intensity of someone about to defend everything she'd built. She wore navy blue, professional and authoritative, her hair swept back to reveal features set with determination. You've got this, Daniel said quietly. I hope so. Because if I don't, we're both looking for new jobs by this afternoon. Sarah appeared in the doorway. Miss Wolfe, the board is ready for you. Miranda stood, gathering her materials and her courage. She paused beside Daniel, and in a gesture that was both professional and intimate, squeezed his hand once. Wish me luck. You don't need luck. You need what you already have, truth and integrity, and the courage to stand up for yourself. Miranda left, and Daniel settled into one of her office chairs to wait. The next 2 hours were the longest of his life. He tried to work, tried to focus on spreadsheets and analysis, but his mind kept circling back to the boardroom where Miranda was defending their relationship and her leadership. At noon, Sarah knocked softly. Mr. Reed, Ms. Wolfe asked me to tell you the meeting is finishing up. She'll be out shortly. Daniel stood, his heart racing with anticipation and dread. When Miranda finally emerged, her expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. But then she stepped into her office, closed the door behind her, and the mask crumbled into something that looked like relief and exhaustion and victory all mixed together. Well? Daniel asked. They voted to support me. Unanimously. Miranda's voice was unsteady, the words emerging in a rush. I presented everything, the documentation about our relationship, the evidence of Julian's stalking, the clear protocols we've established to prevent any conflict of interest. And then I told them that I refuse to let a man who's been harassing me for months dictate my personal or professional choices. And they believed you? Sandra Kim spoke up, said she'd witnessed Julian's behavior Tuesday night, that my response seemed entirely justified given the provocation. 2 other board members mentioned they'd also noticed Julian being inappropriate at various events over the past 6 months. Once I opened that door, other people felt safe sharing their observations. Daniel felt something unclench in his chest. So Julian's credibility is shot. Completely. The board is actually considering asking his company to recuse itself from future Morrison and Lynch events until he can demonstrate more professional behavior. And they've mandated that our HR department create better protocols for handling interpersonal harassment at corporate functions. The victory was larger than just their relationship. Miranda had exposed a pattern of behavior that had likely affected other people, and in doing so, had potentially prevented future harassment. I'm so proud of you, Daniel said quietly. That took enormous courage. I was terrified the entire time, but then I thought about you standing up to Julian at that dinner, about Emma asking if I was going to be her new mommy, about all the ways fear has controlled my choices for too long, and I decided I was done being afraid. Miranda crossed the space between them, and Daniel met her halfway. When she kissed him, it was different from their careful public performances. This was honest and relieved and full of hope for what came next. So we're really doing this, Miranda asked when they pulled apart. Actually building a relationship, not just performing one? We're really doing this, Daniel confirmed. Messy and complicated and probably still full of challenges, but real. I should warn you, I'm terrible at domestic things. I can't cook beyond basic scrambled eggs. I've never built a fort before last weekend, and my apartment is pristinely empty because I don't know how to make space feel lived in. And I should warn you that my life is chaos. Emma's schedule is complicated, my apartment is small, I work long hours and still barely make ends meet. Dating me means dealing with daycare pickups and kindergarten concerts, and the reality that I'm a package deal with a 5-year-old who will absolutely test your patience and steal your heart simultaneously. I know, Miranda said, and I'm choosing it anyway. Choosing you, choosing Emma, choosing the possibility that maybe family isn't about perfection or convenience, but about showing up and trying and being brave enough to love people, even when it's complicated. The words settled between them, a promise and a commitment that went beyond their initial arrangement. Daniel thought about Rachel, about the family they'd planned to build before a drunk driver had stolen that future. Thought about the 18 months of grief and survival that had taught him both how fragile life was and how resilient love could be. Rachel would have liked you, he said quietly. She had strong opinions about people who let fear make their decisions. She'd be glad I found someone brave enough to face down board meetings and angry ex-fiancés. I wish I could have met her, known the woman who helped make you who you are. She's part of Emma, part of our family's story, even though she's gone. That doesn't change just because we're building something new. I know, and I would never want it to. Emma's love for her mother is beautiful, and I hope I can honor that while also finding my own place in your lives. They talked for another hour, mapping out a path forward that felt both terrifying and possible. They'd continue maintaining professional boundaries at work, but they'd stop hiding their relationship. They'd introduce Miranda more gradually into Emma's routine, building connection without rushing attachment. They'd navigate family dinners and weekend activities and the thousand small negotiations of blending two very different lives into something cohesive. That evening, Daniel picked up Emma from daycare to find Mrs. Chen watching him with careful assessment. "The board meeting went well, I take it?" she asked. "How did you—" "Sarah Chen is my niece," Mrs. Chen said with a slight smile. "She texted me this afternoon, said her boss stood up to some very powerful men and won." Daniel felt the pieces click into place. "You've been getting reports on Miranda this whole time." "I've been getting reports on the woman my favorite single father was getting involved with, yes. And I've been cautiously optimistic about what Sarah's been telling me. Miranda Wolf apparently treats her staff with respect, works harder than anyone in the building, and just risked her entire career to establish appropriate harassment protocols. Those are not the actions of someone who's careless with other people's hearts." The approval was subtle but significant. Mrs. Chen's blessing mattered more than Daniel had fully realized until this moment. "She's coming to dinner Sunday," Daniel said, "and we're going to keep building this carefully and honestly with Emma's well-being as our priority." "Good. Just remember what I said about boundaries and pacing. Emma's resilient, but she's also fragile. She needs stability more than she needs another parent right now." "I know. We're being careful." Mrs. Chen nodded, then softened. "I hope it works out, Daniel. You deserve happiness. Emma deserves to see her father building a life that includes love and partnership. Just protect her heart while you're protecting your own." Sunday dinner was different from their previous time together, more intentional, more like an actual family building connection than crisis management. Miranda brought ingredients for her mother's pasta recipe, the one domestic skill she'd mastered during her brief rebellion against catered everything. Emma helped measure and mix, her small hands covered in flour and her face bright with concentration. They ate together at Daniel's small table, and the conversation flowed with easy comfort. Emma talked about school, Miranda shared carefully edited stories about board meetings and corporate life, and Daniel watched the two most important people in his current world learn to be comfortable with each other. After dinner, Emma retreated to her room to play while Daniel and Miranda cleaned up. The domestic routine felt right, in a way that Daniel hadn't experienced since before Rachel's death. The simple partnership of shared tasks, comfortable silences, the ordinary magic of building life together. "I've been thinking," Miranda said as she dried dishes, "about my apartment, how empty it is, how it's never felt like home. And I wondered if maybe you and Emma might help me change that. Come over next weekend. Help me pick out some things that make it feel lived in instead of staged." The invitation was both practical and symbolic, Miranda asking them to help her build a life that included warmth and personality and the comfortable mess of actual living. "We'd love that," Daniel said. "Emma has very strong opinions about decorating. Fair warning. I'm counting on it. I need someone to tell me that perfect isn't the goal anymore. That a little chaos and color and crayon drawings on the fridge are what makes space feel like home." They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, and when Miranda left that evening, Emma gave her a tight hug and made her promise to come back soon. Daniel walked Miranda to the building's entrance, aware that his neighbors were probably watching and judging and creating their own narratives about the CEO visiting the single father's modest apartment. "Thank you," Miranda said quietly, "for being patient with me while I figured out how to be brave, for not giving up when this got complicated and scary, for showing me that sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying to control everything and just let yourself fall." "Thank you for trusting me enough to fall," Daniel replied, "for choosing honesty over performance, for standing up to Julian, for being willing to build something real even when the odds seemed impossible." They kissed in the building's small lobby, unhurried and tender, and Daniel felt something settle into place that had been unmoored since Rachel's death. Not replacement, not forgetting, but the possibility of moving forward while still honoring the past. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Miranda came to dinner twice a week, gradually becoming a familiar presence without overwhelming Emma's routine. They had their first real argument about parenting approaches when Miranda questioned Daniel's permissiveness about bedtime negotiations, and they learned to navigate disagreement with honesty and compromise. Emma asked fewer questions about when Miranda was coming back and more questions about what they'd do together next, showing her acceptance of Miranda as a stable presence instead of a temporary visitor. At work, Daniel and Miranda maintained professional distance that occasionally slipped into warm glances and inside jokes that made Sarah smile knowingly. Marcus Webb continued making snide comments until Daniel's next performance review came back with exceptional ratings, proving that his relationship with Miranda hadn't resulted in inappropriate favoritism. Julian Cross made one final attempt at contact, showing up at a Morrison and Lynch event, but security removed him quickly after Miranda had obtained a formal restraining order backed by months of documented harassment. 3 months after that first desperate Friday night when Miranda had whispered, "Take me home or you're fired," Daniel found himself back at the same bar where everything had started. But this time, there was no threat, no desperation, no dangerous ex-fiancé watching from across the room. This time, it was just the two of them, celebrating Miranda's birthday with cocktails and the easy comfort of people who'd survived crisis together and emerged stronger. "I've been thinking about that night," Miranda said, swirling her drink with a slight smile. "How terrified I was. How certain that asking you for help would destroy everything. And how wrong I was about almost all of it." "You weren't wrong about Julian being dangerous," Daniel pointed out, "or about needing help." "No, but I was wrong about the cost. I thought letting you into my crisis would mean losing control, exposing weakness, risking my career and reputation. Instead, it gave me back my life, helped me find the courage to stop performing perfection and start building something real." Daniel reached across the table for her hand, the gesture automatic now after months of learning each other's comfort zones and boundaries. "I'm glad you were brave enough to ask. Glad you trusted me with the messy parts. I'm glad you were brave enough to say yes, to stand beside me even when it got ugly, to help me face down Julian and the board and my own fears about being vulnerable." They finished their drinks and walked out into the Manhattan night, and Miranda paused at the entrance where she'd first grabbed Daniel's arm in desperate need. "Take me home?" she asked, but this time the words carried no threat, no desperation. Just invitation, just choice, just the simple request of someone who'd found safety and wanted to keep choosing it. Daniel smiled, thinking of Emma waiting at home with Mrs. Chen, of the life they were building together one careful day at a time. "Always," he said, and meant it as promise and commitment and the hope that sometimes broken people could help each other heal. They took a car back to Queens, to the modest apartment where Miranda now kept spare clothes and favorite coffee and the comfortable claim of someone who belonged. Emma was already asleep, Mrs. Chen having handled bedtime with practiced efficiency. They paid her and thanked her, and after she left, Daniel and Miranda stood together in the quiet apartment looking at Emma's latest artwork on the fridge, another crayon drawing, this one showing 4 stick figures now, including Mrs. Chen, because Emma's concept of family had expanded to include everyone who showed up consistently with love. "She added Mrs. Chen," Miranda observed, smiling at the drawing. "That's new. She told me yesterday that family isn't just people who live together, it's people who take care of each other. Pretty wise for a 5-year-old. She learned it from you, from watching you build a community of support after Rachel died, from seeing you be brave about accepting help and offering it." They settled onto the couch together, Miranda curling against Daniel's side with the easy comfort of people who'd learned to fit together through patience and practice. The television played quietly, some show neither of them was really watching, while they simply existed in the ordinary magic of shared space. "I love you," Miranda said quietly, the words emerging naturally instead of dramatically. "I know it's only been 3 months, and I know we're still figuring things out, but I love you and Emma and this life we're building together." Daniel felt the words settle into his chest, warm and right and not at all frightening despite everything Mrs. Chen had warned about rushing into feelings. "I love you too. Have for a while now, probably since you stood up at that dinner and defended me with such fierce conviction." "That seems early for love," Miranda observed. "Maybe. Or maybe sometimes you recognize something worth protecting, and love just grows from that recognition. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Glad we took the risk." They sat together in the quiet apartment, Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, and let themselves believe that sometimes impossible situations worked out, that sometimes fiction became reality in the best possible way, that sometimes a desperate whisper in a Manhattan bar could lead to family and partnership and the kind of love that was built on honesty instead of performance. 6 months later, Miranda's apartment finally looked lived in. Emma's artwork decorated the fridge, Daniel's books filled previously empty shelves, and the pristine white walls now featured photographs of all three of them at various parks and museums in ordinary moments. It wasn't perfect or magazine-ready anymore, but it was home in a way it had never been when Miranda lived there alone. They split their time between both apartments now, giving Emma stability in Queens while also teaching her that family could exist in multiple spaces. Mrs. Chen had long since stopped giving warnings about attachment and started giving advice about blended family dynamics. Sarah Chen had become an unofficial aunt figure to Emma, sometimes babysitting when both Daniel and Miranda had evening commitments. Julian Cross had faded into background noise, his manipulation losing power once Miranda stopped being afraid of him. The restraining order held, and his professional reputation had suffered enough that he'd stopped trying to insert himself into Morrison and Lynch's social circles. Daniel had been promoted, but only after a rigorous review process that proved his advancement was based entirely on merit and had nothing to do with his relationship with Miranda. He still worked long hours, still struggled with work-life balance, but now he had a partner who understood corporate pressure and helped him navigate the impossible mathematics of career ambition and single parenthood. Emma was thriving. Her nightmares had mostly stopped, replaced by dreams about pancakes and fort construction and the expanding world of a child who felt safe enough to be happy. She still talked about Rachel, still kept her mother's memory alive through stories and photographs, but she'd also accepted that families could grow and change without forgetting the people who'd been lost. One ordinary Tuesday evening, while Emma was at a friend's house for a play date and Daniel and Miranda had rare alone time, they found themselves back at the same bar where everything had started. It had become their tradition, monthly visits to the place where Miranda had first whispered her desperate request, a reminder of how far they'd come. "I was thinking," Miranda said as they settled into a quiet corner booth, "about something Emma asked me yesterday. She wanted to know if I was going to be her stepmom someday." Daniel felt his heart rate accelerate, aware that this conversation had been building for months, but neither of them had quite been brave enough to start it. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that I loved her very much, and that I loved her daddy very much, and that sometimes adults need time to figure out the right way to build a family together. Then she asked if I was going to marry you, and I told her that was something you and I needed to talk about first. And now we're talking about it?" Miranda reached into her purse and pulled out a small box, setting it on the table between them with a slightly tremulous smile. "I know traditionally the man proposes, but I've never been very good at following traditional scripts, and I figured since I was the one who started this whole thing with a desperate plea in a bar, I might as well be the one to make it permanent." Daniel stared at the box, his mind racing through implications and logistics and the magnitude of what Miranda was suggesting. "You're proposing to me?" "I'm proposing that we stop splitting time between apartments and build one home together. That we give Emma the stable family structure she deserves. That we make official what we've been building for the past 9 months. A partnership based on honesty and courage and the understanding that sometimes the best things come from impossible circumstances." She opened the box to reveal a simple band, elegant without being ostentatious, exactly the kind of ring Daniel would have chosen for himself. "I know it's fast. I know Mrs. Chen probably has opinions about timeline and Emma's adjustment, but Daniel, I don't want to wait anymore. I want to wake up in the same home every morning. I want to be there for Emma's bedtime stories without it being a special occasion. I want to build a life with you that doesn't require calendars and negotiations about whose apartment we're staying at tonight." Daniel looked at the ring, at Miranda's hopeful and terrified expression, at the future being offered across a bar table where 9 months ago he'd simply been trying to help someone drowning. He thought about Rachel, about the family they'd planned to build, about the grief that had taught him both how precious love was and how brave you had to be to risk it again. "Yes," he said quietly, watching joy break across Miranda's face. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, we'll build a home together. Yes, I'm brave enough to choose this future even though it's terrifying and complicated and probably going to challenge us in ways we can't even anticipate yet." Miranda slid the ring onto his finger, and it fit perfectly, like she'd somehow known his size without asking. Later, Daniel would learn that Sarah had coordinated with Mrs. Chen to get his measurements, that this proposal had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that Miranda brought to board presentations and corporate strategy. They kissed across the table, and when they pulled apart, Miranda was crying and smiling simultaneously. "We should go tell Emma. She made me promise to let her know immediately if you said yes." "She knew you were going to propose?" "I asked her permission first, told her that if she wasn't ready for me to officially become part of your family, I would wait as long as necessary. But she said, and I quote, 'Rhonda, you're already family. The ring just makes it so other people know too.'" Daniel felt tears prick his own eyes at his daughter's wisdom, at the resilience that had allowed her to accept new love without forgetting the mother she'd lost. "She's pretty smart for a 5-year-old. She gets it from her dad," Miranda said softly. "The courage to build something new while honoring what came before. The understanding that family isn't about replacing people, it's about expanding capacity for love." They left the bar hand in hand, riding back to Queens where Emma was waiting with barely contained excitement. When they walked into the apartment, she took one look at Daniel's ring and launched herself at both of them with a squeal of pure joy. "You said yes! Daddy said yes! We're going to be a real family!" "We already were a real family, sweetheart," Daniel said, catching his daughter and holding her close. "This just makes it official." Emma pulled back to look at both of them seriously. "Does this mean Miranda's my mom now?" Miranda knelt down to Emma's level, her expression tender. "I'm not replacing your mommy. She'll always be your mommy, watching from the stars and loving you. But if you want, I can be your mom too. A different kind of mom who's here for pancakes and homework help and bedtime stories. Is that okay?" Emma considered this with the gravity of a child making an important decision. "Can I call you Mom Randa? Like how Mrs. Chen is Mrs. Chen who gives me cookies?" Miranda laughed, joy and relief mixing in the sound. "I love that. Mom Randa is perfect." They spent the evening celebrating with ice cream and Emma's insistence on calling everyone she knew to share the news. Mrs. Chen got the first call. Her response a mixture of happy congratulations and pointed reminders about marriage counseling and realistic expectations. Jennifer Martinez from the park was thrilled. Even Sandra Kim, when Miranda called her the next day, expressed genuine happiness and immediately began planning an engagement party. The wedding happened 4 months later in a small ceremony that honored both simplicity and significance. Emma was flower girl, wearing a purple dress that she'd picked out herself and carrying a basket of petals that she scattered with dramatic flair. Mrs. Chen attended with her husband, sitting in the front row and crying throughout the entire ceremony. Sarah Chen stood as Miranda's maid of honor, having become close friend as well as assistant over the months of crisis and celebration. Daniel's vows acknowledged Rachel, thanking her for teaching him how to love and promising to honor her memory while building this new chapter. Miranda's vows acknowledged the fear that had nearly kept her from accepting help, the courage it had taken to trust someone with her vulnerability, the gratitude she felt for Daniel's steady presence through every crisis. When they kissed as married couple, Emma cheered loudly enough to make everyone laugh, her joy uncontained and infectious. The reception was casual and warm, held at a restaurant in Queens that served excellent food and didn't require formal attire. Julian Cross was notably absent, though rumor had it he'd left New York entirely after his professional reputation had been damaged beyond repair by the harassment allegations. They honeymooned as a family, 3 days at a beach house in the Hamptons where Emma collected shells and built sandcastles while Daniel and Miranda stole quiet moments to simply exist together as husband and wife. It wasn't exotic or elaborate, but it was perfect for what they needed. Time to simply be together without crisis or complication. When they returned to New York, it was to a new apartment that was neither Daniel's modest Queens place nor Miranda's pristine penthouse, but something in between. A 3-bedroom in a good school district, with space for Emma's toys and Daniel's books, and Miranda's gradually expanding collection of things that made space feel lived in. The walls featured Emma's artwork alongside professional photographs. The kitchen held both basic supplies and Miranda's slowly improving cooking experiments, and the refrigerator displayed the very first drawing Emma had made, Three stick figures holding hands, labeled with names that had seemed impossible 9 months ago, but now felt like destiny. 1 year after that desperate Friday night, when Miranda had whispered her plea and Daniel had chosen to help, they found themselves back at the same bar for their anniversary. Emma was home with Sarah Chen, who'd become unofficial family member and beloved babysitter. The bar was quieter on this Tuesday evening, no dangerous ex-fiancés lurking, no corporate politics demanding attention. "I've been thinking about that night," Daniel said, echoing Miranda's words from months ago. "How I almost walked away. How close I came to just heading home to Emma and leaving you to figure out Julian on your own. What stopped you? You looked terrified, and I couldn't walk past someone drowning. Not again. Not after failing to save Rachel." Daniel paused, organizing thoughts he'd been processing for months. "But I think I was drowning too, in a different way. Drowning in grief and survival mode and the belief that safety meant never risking my heart again. You saved me as much as I saved you." Miranda reached for his hand, the wedding band on her finger catching the bar's low light. "We saved each other. That's what the best partnerships do. They're mutual rescue operations disguised as romance." "That's very poetic for someone who claims to be terrible at emotions." "I've been practicing. Emma's been teaching me about feelings and honesty and the importance of saying I love you even when it feels scary." They ordered the same drinks they'd had that first night, a toast to impossible beginnings and the courage it took to choose connection over safety. The bartender who'd witnessed Miranda's desperate plea didn't remember them, but that was okay. This tradition was for them, a reminder of how far they'd come and how much they'd risk to build something real. "Take me home?" Miranda asked as they finished their drinks, repeating her words from that first desperate night. But this time, home wasn't a refuge from danger or a temporary shelter. Home was the 3-bedroom apartment where Emma waited with her latest crayon masterpiece. Home was the life they'd built together from crisis and courage. Home was the family they'd chosen and fought for and protected through every complication. "Always," Daniel said, and they walked out into the Manhattan night together, hand in hand, heading toward the home they'd built and the future they'd chosen and the ordinary magic of love that was brave enough to bloom in impossible circumstances. Behind them, the bar faded into the city's endless rhythm, just another location where lives intersected and changed course. But for Daniel and Miranda, it would always be the place where everything began, where a desperate whisper became a turning point, where fear transformed into courage, where a single father and a drowning CEO found the strength to save each other and build something worth protecting. Their story wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated and full of moments where they'd stumbled or struggled or doubted whether love could survive the weight of their respective damage. But it was real and honest and built on the understanding that sometimes the best things happen when you're brave enough to help someone drowning, even when you're barely staying afloat yourself. And as they rode the subway back to Queens, Miranda's head on Daniel's shoulder and their hands intertwined, they carried with them the knowledge that would sustain them through whatever challenges came next. That strength wasn't loud or flashy or dramatic. Strength was steady and loving, and showing up day after day, choosing partnership over perfection and courage over fear. Emma would grow up with this understanding woven into the fabric of her world, that families could be built from loss and new love, that her mother in the stars and her mom Randa at home could both exist in her heart simultaneously, that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to love anyway. The city lights glittered outside the subway windows, millions of lives intersecting in the complicated mathematics of human connection. And somewhere in that vast sprawl, 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds were building a life that proved love didn't have to be easy to be worth it. It just had to be honest and brave and willing to grow. The story that had started with whispered desperation in a Manhattan bar ended with whispered promises in a Queens apartment, with Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, and 2 people who'd learned that sometimes the greatest courage is accepting help when you need it and offering it when someone else does. And that was more than enough. That was everything.